Love is Here and Now Gone. Written by P.O. Dixon. Read by Christopher. Chapter 1. Kent, England, April 1812. Fitzwilliam Darcy shifted in the barouche adorned with his family's crest, his thoughts in turmoil. His cousin, Colonel Richard Fitzwilliam, had insisted on paying one last visit to the parsonage before departing Kent. The Colonel, ever the sociable and considerate gentleman, was keen to check on Miss Elizabeth Bennet's well-being, worried that their recent conversation might have played a part in her indisposition, which had led to her absence from Rosings the previous night. Darcy himself was suffering a mixture of reluctance and anticipation, uncertain of how to face the young woman again after their last encounter. "She seemed well enough when last I saw her, though somewhat disconcerted," he said, glancing at Darcy. Darcy made no response, prompting the other man to continue. "Do you not wish to know why I suspect she was upset?" "You wish to tell me," Darcy responded, his gaze fixed out the carriage window, "and given our present circumstances, I am obliged to listen." This was encouragement enough. "I fear I mentioned the circumstances from last autumn in Hertfordshire, the incident involving your successful intervention to rescue a friend from an imprudent match." Darcy's jaw tightened. "I wish you had not." "Why ever not?" Fitzwilliam asked, taken aback by his cousin's reaction. "I spoke nothing but the truth. Yet, in hindsight, I cannot help but feel that Miss Elizabeth might have some connection with the family we were discussing. It leaves me wondering if I should have held my tongue." "Connection indeed. The young lady in question was her elder sister and the gentleman, Charles Bingley," Darcy explained. "Pray, how did it not dawn on you that the family was Miss Elizabeth's own?" Colonel Fitzwilliam's eyes widened in disbelief. "You cannot mean it. Miss Elizabeth Bennet's family? Why, there is nothing in her character indicative of the impropriety you described. Indeed, your behaviour toward her these past weeks has hinted strongly at admiration, if not more. One might even suggest that our delay in leaving Kent stems from your reluctance to part from her company." "Pray do not remind me," Darcy muttered, a bitter edge to his voice. "All the more reason we ought to pay a proper farewell call," the Colonel insisted. "You owe her an explanation, if only to dispel any misunderstanding my indiscretion might have caused." As their carriage approached the parsonage, Darcy finally yielded to his cousin's persistent urging. A part of him supposed there could be little harm in seeing Elizabeth one last time. Perhaps, after reading his letter, a painstaking refutation of Wickham's deceitful tales and an honest account of his intentions concerning Bingley and her sister, she might lean toward forgiveness. Darcy gave an inaudible harumph, for he struggled to concede that he'd committed any real offence. "I acted reasonably. She is the one who behaved imprudently. How dare someone of her standing refuse me?" Half an hour later, Darcy found himself seated in the Collinses' parlour, his eyes shifting between the slowly ticking mantel clock and the doorway that remained empty. The fresh aroma of tea lingered in the air, but it did nothing to calm his busy mind. He then consulted his own watch. "Where is she?" The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity, each tick of the second hand amplifying his impatience. Surely she should have returned by now. Had Elizabeth reached the parsonage, seen his carriage, and chosen to prolong her walk rather than encounter him? Could he really blame her? His letter had been composed not to assuage her feelings, but to justify his own conduct. Its opening line could not help but intrude. "Be not alarmed, madam, at receiving this letter, nor apprehend any renewal of those sentiments or offers which were last night so disgusting to you." Colonel Fitzwilliam stood abruptly, cutting off whatever nonsense Lady Catherine de Bourgh's sycophantic vicar, Mr. William Collins, was in the middle of espousing, and likewise interrupting Darcy's musing. "I shall seek Miss Bennet myself," he announced. "She cannot be far." "A plain-looking, sensible woman," Mrs. Charlotte Collins said. "I am sure she will return soon, but if you think it best—" Darcy stood, cutting off any further debate. "Your eagerness to spare Miss Bennet's displeasure is commendable, Fitzwilliam, but we dare not delay our departure further. I risk missing an important appointment with my solicitor if we do not leave at once." Turning to Charlotte, he said, "Mrs. Collins," and nodded toward Mr. Collins, "please convey our sincerest wishes for Miss Bennet's pleasurable remaining stay, and her safe return to Hertfordshire." The look of frustration etched on Fitzwilliam's face was unmistakable. His brow furrowed and lips pressed tightly together, but Darcy remained unaffected by his cousin's silent protest. With a composed demeanour, he preceded Fitzwilliam out the door and into the waiting carriage. Once again inside the confines of the carriage, Colonel Fitzwilliam eyed Darcy with a mix of curiosity and scepticism. "A meeting with your solicitor? Since when do you hide behind such flimsy excuses? It almost seemed like you were trying to avoid encountering Miss Elizabeth. Were you so afraid of her reception?" Darcy sighed, staring out of his window at the passing countryside. "I need not guess at her reception. I know how she feels, as I spoke with her last evening. Like you, I was concerned by her absence at Rosings, and having a matter of immense importance to discuss with her, I left our party under the guise of urgent business affairs." Fitzwilliam frowned. "If memory serves, you claimed pressing business affairs required your immediate attention, and sequestered yourself in the study." "No," Darcy confessed. "I was instead with Miss Elizabeth." He brushed both hands over his face before resuming his speech. "To make a long story short, I offered her my hand in marriage." The Colonel drew in a sharp breath, stunned. "Good God, and she refused?" "Trust me, I was just as surprised as you are," Darcy said. "Well, you appear unharmed physically, so I presume her rejection was not violent, even if your confidence is a bit shaken. If words alone could physically pierce, I might easily have bled to death." "Surely it was not so dire as that," Fitzwilliam said. "It was worse," Darcy admitted. Her refusal left no room for hope or reconciliation. She made her sentiments unmistakably clear. Colonel Fitzwilliam, ever the optimist, persisted. "I understand your pride is wounded, Darcy, but elegant young ladies often refuse initial proposals, preferring to keep respectable gentlemen in suspense. You ought not to dismiss a future with Miss Elizabeth altogether so easily as that." Darcy regarded his cousin in disbelief. She left no doubt as to her disdain, founded upon wilful misunderstandings and misplaced trust. "Then correct the misunderstandings," the Colonel urged. "Upon our arrival in town, inform Bingley of your error regarding Miss Bennet. Go with him to Hertfordshire, and properly court Miss Elizabeth. Surely, if your feelings prompted a proposal of marriage, you must love her. What is a little hardship compared to the reward of winning the woman with whom you meant to spend the rest of your life?" Darcy's eyes narrowed. "Rejecting my hand in marriage is surely the greatest mistake in her life. The least I can do is put myself directly in her path, allowing her to see what she's missing and reconsider her stance. I shall go to Hertfordshire. I will make her fall hopelessly in love with me, and this time I shall guard my heart, ensuring she never again possesses the power to wound me so deeply. Not ever again." Darcy straightened in his seat, the tension in his jaw giving way to a look of fixed determination. "When next she sees me, she will find not the man she spurned, but the man she will find herself unable to resist." As the carriage rolled on toward London, Darcy's mind churned with schemes and strategies. He now knew exactly how he would go about showing Elizabeth Bennet the error of her ways. Upon arriving at his London townhouse, Darcy wasted no time in setting his plans in motion. He dispatched a note to Bingley, requesting his friend's presence at the earliest opportunity. When Bingley arrived, full of his usual good cheer and amiability, he was ushered into the study, after which assuming his usual attitude whenever a guest at Darcy House. "Bingley, I must confess to a grave error in judgment," Darcy began, once the obligatory discussion of the visit, the weather, and the roads had been exhausted. "It seems I was mistaken about the nature of Miss Jane Bennet's affections for you. New information has come to light that suggests she may indeed return your regard. A sweet-tempered, charming man, and several years Darcy's junior." Bingley's eyes widened. "Truly, Darcy, this is wonderful news. But what has prompted this change of heart on your part?" Darcy cleared his throat. "Suffice it to say, I have had reason to reconsider my previous assessment. The fault lies entirely with me and my misinterpretation of the situation. I would strongly encourage you to return to Hertfordshire and renew your attentions to Miss Bennet. That is to say, if your feelings remain unchanged." "Unchanged?" Bingley exclaimed. "My feelings have only grown stronger during our time apart. I shall waste no time in returning to Netherfield and seeking her out. Will you accompany me, Darcy? I would value your support and guidance." Darcy feigned hesitation for only a moment before nodding his assent. "Of course, Bingley. I have some business of my own to attend to in Hertfordshire. We shall travel together." As the two friends made their plans and preparations, Darcy's thoughts remained fixed on Elizabeth. He imagined her surprise and disbelief upon seeing him again, the gradual softening of her manner as he proved himself worthy of her affections. He would be charming, attentive, and irresistible, everything a proper suitor needed to be. And in the end, she will be mine, just as I intended from the start. Chapter 2. Hertfordshire, England, weeks later. The road to Hertfordshire stretched ahead, but it was not the distance that gave him pause. It was the memory of another silence long ago, entirely a different time and place, one having to do with another woman in his life, his mother, the late Lady Anne Darcy. Even as a boy, Fitzwilliam Darcy had understood that there were two versions of his mother. One belonged to society, poised, admired, radiant in her silks and pearls. The other existed within Pemberley's walls, restless, elusive, shaped by a restraint that softened on occasion, only to harden again without warning. Some days she would laugh with abandon and draw him into her joy, holding his hand as though she meant never to let go. Other days she would vanish into her rooms for hours, sometimes days, and the only sound from within would be the slow turn of pages or the faint chime of fine porcelain. Darcy had once believed he could temper her moods with affection. He remembered it all too painfully. He was 9, perhaps 10, and she had just returned from London, overwrought and exhausted. When she passed him in the corridor, distracted and silent, he had followed her into the sitting room and placed a hand over hers. "I missed you, mother," young Darcy had whispered. Her hand had stiffened beneath his, her smile had faltered. "Do not make a scene, Fitzwilliam," she had said in stark dismissal, pulling her hand away and retreating behind the cover of a nearby letter. He had learned much at that moment, how swiftly warmth could cool, how love, even when freely offered, might not be wanted. Her withdrawal had not been cruel, but it had wounded him all the same. From that day on he never reached first. He grew up indulged, protected, and deeply instructed, but never again a victim of unguarded emotions. What he felt, he kept hidden. What he longed for, he rarely named. In society they praised his reserve. At home, they respected it, and in solitude he fortified it. It was no accident that he had mastered self-control. It was survival. And now, close to 2 decades later, he found himself riding beside his friend Bingley on the road to Hertfordshire, his purpose cloaked in the guise of friendship. But it was not mere camaraderie that brought him back. He had proposed to a woman who had refused him with cutting clarity, a woman who had known the full extent of his feelings and returned none of them. He had overcome his struggle, bared his soul to another, and for it he had been wounded, dismissed. Here he was on the precipice of something dangerous, something that could either restore his pride or destroy what remained of his equanimity. But this time he would not subject his heart to such pain again. While it was the prevailing expectation that Mr. Bingley should one day return to Netherfield, Mr. Darcy's return to Hertfordshire, in company with his friend, could not go unnoticed. Quite the contrary, for no one expected him, not after the haughty manner in which he had comported himself when he was last in the vicinity. From the moment the two gentlemen were spotted on horseback near the edge of Meryton, word spread with such swiftness that by evening half the neighbourhood had already drawn their own conclusions as to how this development must affect the future of the single daughters in that part of the county. At Longbourn the news was met with mixed reactions. Mrs. Bennet declared it a blessing for her Jane, despite having long since discarded Charles Bingley as capricious and not worthy of her eldest daughter. Elizabeth, who had shared little of her time spent in company with one of the gentlemen in Kent, had even less to say. Miss Mary was even more indifferent than Elizabeth pretended to be, and the two younger girls, Miss Kitty and Miss Lydia, were chiefly concerned about whether Mr. Bingley might soon give another ball. The next day there the gentleman stood in Longbourn's parlour, the older of the two every inch the gentleman he had always been in appearance, with his handsome features and noble mien, and yet so altered in manner that Elizabeth scarcely knew what to make of him. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, bowing. His greeting was courteous, even pleasant by his standards, bearing none of the stiffness she recalled so vividly. He spoke to her with the same steady reserve he used for everyone else, nothing more, nothing less. "Mr. Darcy," Elizabeth said, careful to match his tone and demeanour, just as her voice betrayed nothing, nor had his. There was nothing in his expression to suggest he harboured ill will over the things she had said, or the things he had said that fateful evening. One would never have known what had happened between the two of them in Kent, the bitterness, the accusations. She knew and understood he meant to keep it that way. When, throughout the course of the visit, it was Mr. Darcy's turn to speak with Mr. Bennet, the younger man made some polite remark about the grounds, which Longbourn's master received with a nod and the barest hint of amusement. Darcy's conversation was impeccable, his composure unshaken. There were no missteps, no breaches in conduct. His performance, if one were to consider it such, was unparalleled, worthy of admiration and observation. And observing him is precisely what Elizabeth found herself doing, studying him more closely than she wished to admit. The man who once declared himself above his company now showed no such disdain. Both listening and engaging, he asked after Kitty and Lydia's pursuits, even invoking his own sister, Miss Georgiana Darcy's similar proclivities as a frame of reference, no doubt, sign of his sincerity. He complimented Mary on her playing, though he must have recalled her exhibition at the Netherfield ball well enough to know what he was about. At one point he had offered to turn the pages for her, eschewing her insistence that she did not wish to impose on him. This is not the proud man who simultaneously insulted my character and proposed in the same breath. He seems changed, Elizabeth allowed, and yet she did not trust the change. She could not. There was something in his manner too perfect, too deliberate. A man might feign charm, a man might learn what to say and when to say it, but a man could not unfeel what he had once so keenly felt. Yet she could not help but wonder at the reason behind it. Elizabeth had slipped from the crowded parlour on the pretence of needing air, and now traced the worn stones of the garden path, her mind replaying the visit's events in search of some hidden clue, anything she might have missed, as though the truth might reveal itself if only she paced long enough. She remembered the moment Mr. Darcy's intense gaze had found hers across the room, the seemingly effortless grace with which he conversed with her family. The instant their fingers had brushed lightly when she passed him the cup of tea, the tenderness of his touch lingering still on her skin. How maddening this preoccupation with a man she had once so thoroughly rejected. She almost voiced her disgust aloud. She had no reason to dwell on him, no cause to wonder at his motives or his intentions, and yet she could not seem to stop herself. Chapter 3. From the moment he entered Longbourn, Darcy knew he would be measured, by Elizabeth, by her family, and by his own memory of what had once passed between them. Still, no expression crossed his face as he offered his bow and his civil greetings. The performance had begun, and he meant to carry it off masterfully. Steady to his purpose, he offered nothing of himself save what he meant for her to see, the perfect picture of composure, confidence, and control. Elizabeth's greeting matched his in tone, civil but not exactly unreadable, having no doubt belied her intent. Good, he surmised, let her wonder at the change. As the visit continued to unfold, he moved through the room with the ease he'd cultivated in London. He conversed with Mr. Bennet about the trees lining the property and the state of the roads, observing the man's sharp eyes beneath the disguise of deep interest. He had endured Mrs. Bennet's exclamations with more patience than he might once have summoned, and offered just enough kindness to chip away the depths of her disapprobation he had earned from last year's indifference. His attention, however, rested where it always had. Elizabeth sat just beyond the reach of his ever-watchful gaze, yet never out of his awareness. She studied him. Of that he was certain. She was trying to make sense of his conduct, and he would give her reason to doubt every judgment she had once made. He had watched Bingley with Jane and saw how effortlessly his friend resumed their former intimacy, but even that display stirred something unpleasant within him. Jane smiled as before, yes, but not as freely, and for the first time Darcy wondered whether the injury he had helped cause had gone deeper than anyone had supposed. The thought unsettled him. Still, he would not falter. When Mary sat at the pianoforte, he had offered to be of assistance, not out of affection or admiration, but because Elizabeth was watching, and he needed her to see what he could be. He had spoken of his sister to Kitty and Lydia, not because they asked, but because it suited his purpose to appear generous and attentive. It cost him little, and it served his aim. His mission, while formidable, surely was not impossible, to win her heart without risking further injury to his own heart. Every word, every gesture, every display was meant to achieve just that, and yet when their eyes met, only for a moment, he felt something stir. Danger. The same danger he had felt upon becoming better acquainted with her at Netherfield all those months ago. A perilous reminder of the pain he had suffered when he had laid his heart so bare in the face of her rejection. How odd to find myself in the same room with the man who proclaimed himself in love with me, most ardently. The same man whose offer of marriage I had spurned, owing to the officious manner of his proposal, that and his injury to my dearest Jane. Elizabeth tore herself away from her reflection in the mirror and wandered over to the window, her busy mind demanding satisfaction. But surely his being here with Bingley must count for something, a part of her argued, even if another part insisted that had he not interfered in the first place, Jane and Bingley might well be husband and wife by now. To further add to the questions in her mind, she asked herself, can a man who has been the means of setting a house on fire be lauded for putting the fire out? Once again, Elizabeth found herself unsure of just what to make of Mr. Darcy, a man seemingly transformed, determined to make himself agreeable among those he had once claimed as beneath him in every possible way. Having memorized his letter by heart, and now fully aware of how mistaken she'd been about his character, part of her could not help but wonder if his behaving in such a manner was meant for her. Surely not, she forced herself to consider, recalling the opening line of his letter, that it was by no means a repetition of those sentiments she had found so disgusting. No, she was sure his apparent change in behaviour was little more than her seeing him in a new light, one no longer tarnished by George Wickham's lies and her own prejudices against him. A funny thing that, now knowing that had she chosen she might very well be this man's betrothed, this man who was now no doubt lost to her forever, for if she knew nothing else about the opposite sex, it was that a man like Mr. Darcy would never deign to offer for the same woman twice. Her spirits half playful, half serious, Elizabeth thought, if a man like Mr. Collins could not be bothered to wait until the dust settled from a failed proposal, surely Mr. Darcy could do no less. Darcy and Bingley were never so animated as they were later that evening as they made their way back to Netherfield Park. As for the latter, the reason was evident, for he was now surer than ever of Jane Bennet's love for him. Her forgiving him so easily for his being away for so long was the surest symptom of love he could imagine. He told his riding companion as much, and further added, I dare say a lesser woman would not have been half so generous as my Jane. His friend's sentiments gave Darcy pause, and he pondered if there were half a chance Elizabeth might be so easily inclined to forgive him for the careless manner in which he had offered her his hand. Bingley's unwavering enthusiasm would not be repressed. I cannot thank you enough for persuading me that Jane's heart was not lost to me, even if I was partly, in part, to blame for persuading you that you never had it in the first place. Even though, but as you explained your motives that you were merely acting the part of a devoted friend, I cannot find fault in you, or my sisters either, because what would be the point of holding a grudge? None of our interests would be served, and besides, your accompanying me to Longbourn today, when you might easily have remained at Netherfield, is the best proof of your contrition, and for that I thank you, although I feared it would be much more of a test of your forbearance than I had expected. One might describe you as the epitome of a perfect gentleman, making love to the Bennets each in their turn, when everyone knows how much you disliked them. His words were like a dagger to Darcy's heart. Had he really comported himself so poorly when he was in Hertfordshire last autumn? Could that have been a factor in Elizabeth's ill opinion of him, and her being caught completely unaware of his love for her? I wish you would not say that, Bingley. What did I say that is not true? What I mean to say is, I do not like being reminded of how I was perceived then. As though unaware of how his words troubled Darcy, Bingley said, Well, it is not as though any bad opinion the Bennets may have suffered toward you before were not replaced by a month's worth of goodwill today. You were everything a gentleman ought to be, going so far as to sit with Miss Mary and turn the music sheets while she exhibited. Dare I ask the reason for what can only be described as this magnanimous alteration? Could it have anything to do with Miss Elizabeth, a consequence of your spending time in each other's company in Kent? I confess it has everything to do with her, Bingley. Despite my having concealed all that unfolded between Miss Elizabeth and me in Kent, I think it is only fair to inform you that, Besides seeing you reconciled with Miss Bennet, I have another purpose in being here in Hertfordshire. One having to do with Miss Elizabeth? Darcy nodded. You see, Bingley, I love her with all my heart and soul. Why did you not tell her when you were in Kent? Or is this a recent revelation? My feelings for her have been of a long duration. Suffice it to say, I don't know the words or the looks that established the foundation, but I am sure I was in the middle before I knew I had begun. In vain I had struggled. The same motives governing my desire to protect you, I could not help but apply to myself. But then I saw her in Kent, during a time and place when I least expected, and it felt serendipitous. A sure sign that, despite all my objections, she and I were meant to be. By reason, by reflection, by everything, I threw caution to the wind and offered her my hand in marriage. Darcy, do you mean to say? Bingley started. And she rejected me, and in the worst possible way, saying I am the last man in the world she could be prevailed on to marry. Bingley's reaction was visible as though the piercing words had been directed at himself. His response, an audible groan, was no less discomforting. Darcy shook his head. Indeed, you can only imagine how I felt hearing the woman to whom I had laid open my heart pronounce so bitter a verdict on the possibility of a future between us. His friend shook his head. The Darcy I know would have been furious. You have always espoused that your good opinion, once lost, is lost forever, yet no one who bore witness to your comportment today could accuse you of harbouring harsh sentiments toward Miss Elizabeth. I do not recall the two of you being half so cordial toward each other before. Perhaps she's had time to reconsider her stance. It is the fashion of young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour, and that sometimes the refusal is repeated a second, or even a third time. In view of that, is it your intention to offer her your hand again? Oddly enough, Colonel Fitzwilliam had uttered words of a similar vein when he and Darcy were on their way to town from Kent. Darcy recalled thinking even then, such advice was more akin to the simpering of a fool. Now hearing Bingley espouse the same wisdom, all but confirmed his initial impression. But on the other hand, what would be the harm in considering it, Darcy thought, with more hope than not. I have every intention of doing so, but not with the same poorly devised, ill-conceived haste as when we were in Kent. I intend to court her properly, as I ought to have done, to win her heart, leaving no part unclaimed. What Darcy did not say, indeed dared not say, at least not aloud, was that he planned to make her see what a mistake she had made in stomping on his own heart so casually as she had done in Kent. Instead, he uttered, "When next I propose to Miss Elizabeth, she will not only be expecting my proposal, she will wish for it. I wish you ever luck in accomplishing said goal, my friend. I suppose a bit of luck will not hurt. That and the greatest alteration in my baser nature I can muster. And while disguise of any sort is indeed my abhorrence, then so be it if a bit of pretence on my part is warranted. If that is what it takes for me to make Miss Elizabeth Bennet realise her mistake in refusing the hand of someone of such consequence as me, Fitzwilliam Darcy, the Master of Pemberley in Derbyshire." Chapter 4. It was both a fortunate accident and a disconcerting turn of events that Elizabeth unexpectedly crossed paths with Mr. Darcy the following morning, just before the first light of dawn. A delicate mist wrapped around the hedgerows, casting a soft glow across the dim landscape. The only sound was the chirping of morning birds. A gentle breeze reminded her how wanting her attire was, as she drew her wrap tighter. Elizabeth had not anticipated meeting anyone, least of all Mr. Darcy, and the sight of him filled her with a mixture of emotions. For a fleeting moment his expression mirrored her own surprise. After a rather uncomfortable exchange of civilities, Mr. Darcy said, "You must know, surely you must know what I felt toward you in Kent has not simply disappeared as a consequence of the harsh words between us. My feelings for you are as they ever were." Here he paused, just long enough to swallow as if summoning his courage. Elizabeth was silent. At length he said, "I can have no reason to suspect your feelings for me have altered, but I hope you will give me the chance to make amends, to prove myself a man worthy of being loved by a woman like you, a woman worthy of being pleased." Elizabeth lowered her eyes, struggling to steady her breath. "Sir, I hope you will not allow yourself to suffer all the burdens of our unfortunate past. Your letter," she began. "If what you're saying is that my letter has softened your opinion of me, then for that I'm more than grateful. but words on a piece of paper can hardly earn me a place in your heart. I know it will take much more than that. I confess the reason for my being here is to court you as you ought to be courted, to win your heart," he said, uncertain if his intentions would be welcomed or spurned. He said nothing more. To reveal the depth of his plan so soon would be to risk too much. His expression, though earnest, betrayed nothing beyond what he chose to share. His voice carried no betrayal of his motives, but inside he was calculating. Only a total and irrevocable capitulation of her heart would do. The way she looked at him was not with suspicion. Dare I call it approbation? Darcy wondered, thinking it too soon. He would not allow himself to dwell upon it. "I should return now," she said, her tone guarded. The disappointment this response invoked was such that he dared not show, for he hoped for more time alone with her. "May I see you back to Longbourn?" he asked, bracing himself still for her possible rejection. Elizabeth hesitated as if caught between decorum and indecision. No, thank you, sir," she exclaimed, her composure slipping. He smiled, a mixture of increasing confidence and a measure of renewed hope. "Then I will see you in a matter of hours, when Bingley calls on your sister." Here he paused, allowing a moment of uncertainty to linger between them before he continued, "And I call on you." Mrs. Bennet was delighted beyond compare in anticipation of the gentleman caller's imminent arrival. The parlour had been neatly arranged twice in as many hours. Jane, ever obliging, endured her mother's fussing over the length of her sleeves, the style of her hair, and the precise degree of lace visible at her collar. Kitty and Lydia were warned not to speak unless spoken to, with the latter only partially heeding the restriction. "Your dress is too dull," Mrs. Bennet muttered, casting a critical eye at Mary, who had taken up her position at the pianoforte. "You do not want to draw attention to yourself for the wrong reasons." "I am not convinced I desire attention of any kind," Mary replied, her fingers already moving over the keys. "Then let your music do the work. It did not escape my notice how the proud Mr. Darcy attended you so faithfully yesterday," her mother said, and promptly turned back to Jane with fresh instruction on how to arrange her lace to her best advantage. The visit to Longbourn that day was met with more ceremony than surprise. Mr. Bingley, to be sure, had earned a welcome reception, but it was Mr. Darcy whose presence unsettled the parlour, just enough to render all civility a conscious effort. He was not unwelcome. In truth, he was barely expected. That is to say, by all but Elizabeth, who still did not quite know how to think or how to feel after that morning's encounter. And yet, there he was, a mixture of composure and enigma. Longbourn's parlour was the picture of harmony. Jane sat nearest the window, a bit of needlework forgotten in her lap, while Kitty and Lydia competed for Mr. Bingley's attention with their usual exuberance. Mr. Bennet, having come in from his library with a look of mild alarm, retreated to a corner with a book and the apparent hope of being overlooked. Darcy, meanwhile, sat near the fireplace, speaking at times even without being spoken to and no doubt observing much. Elizabeth had taken the seat across from him. Though she made a point of engaging with her sisters, her awareness of his presence remained constant. When at length the conversation turned to old acquaintances, Mr. Bennet, an odd mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve and caprice, glanced over his spectacles and remarked, "It is a fine thing, is it not, that a man may spend a season away, return with better manners, and earn more praise than if he had behaved well all along?" A few laughed, and even Elizabeth smiled, but it was Darcy who stiffened. Barely, but enough. Mrs. Bennet, missing the slight pause, added, "Time improves a man, if he has sense enough to learn something by it. I have always said as much." The remark was flippant, unstudied, and yet it struck all the same. Darcy's expression remained blank, but something in his eyes shifted. Elizabeth caught it. She could not have named the feeling. It was not shame, nor pride exactly, but a tightening, as if he were reminded of some long-resolved lesson he had no wish to revisit. He turned to the window as though the garden offered some immediate interest. Elizabeth, watching him, again wondered at the nature of his change. He appeared a man improved, but improvement of what kind? She, who had once accused him of arrogance, now doubted she understood him at all. Indeed, one must suppose a little time and distance usually are all it ever takes, Mrs. Bennet observed, not without a glance in Mr. Darcy's direction. How quickly opinions change when convenience requires it. Elizabeth coloured a little. She could not help frequently glancing at Mr. Darcy, though every glance convinced her of what she dreaded, for though he was not always looking at her mother, she was convinced that his attention was invariably fixed by her. Would her mother never cease speaking so injudiciously in this gentleman's presence? Elizabeth wondered. Had Mr. Bingley's escape from that part of the country last November in the wake of her boasting of an imminent wedding at Netherfield not taught her temperance? Apparently not, she considered. Darcy's countenance betrayed nothing, but inside the remark struck deeper than he dared allow to show. He knew what he had once conveyed, however unintentionally, and he knew how far he must go to convince not just Elizabeth, but the whole of her family, that the man they remembered was not the man who sat among them now. All his pretences thus far had been insufficient to persuade Mrs. Bennet he was a changed man. He had thought his presence at Longbourn, obliging, attentive, would speak for itself, yet he heard it in her tone. To her, as to others in the room, he was beginning to suspect he was still the man who had once dismissed Hertfordshire, and all who lived in it. Do I ever have my work cut out in order to prove otherwise? Although Mr. Darcy felt the full weight of scrutiny, he did not mean to show it as each Bennet responded to his presence in a manner most characteristic. Lydia, emboldened by the memory of his reportedly having £10,000 a year, declared that she would not mind marrying into a place like Pemberley, drawing an audible gasp from Jane and an incredulous look from Elizabeth. Later, when the conversation grew fragmented, and the others were momentarily distracted by the antics of Lydia and a toppled teacup, Elizabeth found herself near the window. Her hand rested lightly on the sash. She did not hear his approach until he spoke. "The atmosphere is steadily improving," he said, as though they had been conversing in that easy manner all afternoon. Elizabeth turned toward him, uncertain whether he referred to the weather or to something more. "I am sure it is much the same as it ever was, sir," she said at last, "though perhaps your perspective has shifted." He held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. His voice lower, he said, "Indeed, I find my opinions altered on many things." She studied his face. It was unreadable, perhaps deliberately so. But something in his voice stirred a response in her. "I am glad to hear it," she said, "though I dare say you're not alone in your reconsiderations." It seemed Elizabeth was considering a truce, if only for a moment. She could not deny the effect of his presence. Nor could she dismiss the idea that his altered manner had something to do with her. His speech earlier that morning had taught her as much. Clearly, this was his way of proving his point. She reminded herself she must be cautious. A gentleman might change, but not so thoroughly and in so short a duration of time. What a test of one's endurance Darcy could not help but consider once free of Elizabeth's relations. Not that he should not have expected it. His unvarnished opinion of her family espoused so harshly that fateful evening at the parsonage could not help but intrude. The situation of your mother's family, though objectionable, was nothing in comparison to that total want of propriety so frequently, so almost uniformly betrayed by herself, by your three younger sisters, and occasionally even by your father. Indeed, the Bennets were just as they ever were. It was he who was endeavouring to endear himself to them. Darcy was more certain than ever of his purpose. He would offer Elizabeth every reason to think well of him. In this he was determined to succeed. "I must, at any cost. I cannot fail again." The carriage rocked with a steady rhythm as it made its way back to Netherfield. But Darcy hardly noticed the motion. His mind lingered on the conversation by the window, on the way Elizabeth's voice had softened. Not with affection, perhaps, but with something that resembled openness. He had said little. It had taken effort not to say more. Words, once wielded without care, had nearly cost him everything. Now, every silence was considered, every remark calculated. Let her weigh it at her leisure. Let her watch him closely. He welcomed her scrutiny now, and if she came to think well of him, if she came to see that he was not the man she had once rejected, then perhaps, in time, she would be willing to hear more. He was already making progress. She had spoken of reconsiderations. He could not be certain of her meaning, but it was enough for now. Chapter 5. The next few days at Longbourn unfolded in much the same fashion as those prior, with visits from Mr. Bingley and inevitably Mr. Darcy. Such was his happy manners that Elizabeth was beginning to suspect he really had changed. He was no Bingley, to be sure, but then that would have been too much. However, as was Mr. Bingley's wont to do with Jane, Mr. Darcy simply positioned himself with such intention that left little doubt he meant to be seen, and whether it was by accident or design, he was often near her. Her eldest sister's repeated observations of Darcy's altered behaviour finally persuaded Elizabeth to confide in Jane that which she had thus far never spoken to anyone about save the gentleman himself. "Jane," Elizabeth began, a hint of reserve in her voice, "I must tell you about what transpired between Mr. Darcy and me in Kent. I had not planned to tell a soul, owing to the delicacy of it all, but what on earth happened? Mr. Darcy offered me his hand in marriage. He proposed," Elizabeth said. In view of her sister's astonished expression, Elizabeth continued, "It has been on my mind incessantly, especially now that we are all together again in Hertfordshire." A picture of contentedness owing to her own lover's return, Jane looked at her sister with curiosity. "Proposed? But how could that have been? It is evident you refused him, Lizzie. But with it being so advantageous a match, I fear I must ask why." Elizabeth sighed, recalling the tumultuous encounter. When he proposed, it was so unexpected, and his words, they were both ardent and, at the same time, wounding. He spoke of his feelings toward me, yet also of the obstacles he perceived in our union. Jane listened intently, her eyes widening with each detail. And how does this explain his behaviour now? "The very next morning he gave me a letter," Elizabeth continued, "in which he addressed my concerns and misunderstandings. I have read it over and over, and though my opinions are not entirely altered, each reading softens my view of him a little more. But not enough to exonerate him, she thought, but did not say. And yet here he was, returning day after day, as if determined to undo every harsh word she had once flung at him." "So, you believe his conduct now is an attempt to make amends?" Jane asked. "Yes, exactly," Elizabeth replied. "Indeed, he told me as much as regards his intention to make amends. It is just that his manner of going about it cannot help but give me pause. He is so thoughtful and pleasant, almost as if he is trying, bit by bit, to prove false the harsh words I once levelled against him. Such a rapid transformation in his character has left me quite confounded." Jane pondered her sister's words for a moment before speaking. "Perhaps it is not so much a transformation, Lizzie, as it is a revelation of his true character. Could it be that the Mr. Darcy we thought we knew was merely a facade, a mask he wore to conceal his true nature?" Elizabeth considered this notion. She shrugged. "It is possible, I suppose. But why would he feel the need to hide his true self?" "Perhaps he feared rejection or vulnerability," Jane suggested. "Or maybe he simply did not know how to express himself in a manner that would be well received." Elizabeth nodded, absorbing her sister's wisdom, even as she recognised Jane only ever saw the best in everyone. Still, it was not an unreasonable surmise. "You may be right, Jane. It is just so difficult to reconcile the man I see now with the one I thought I knew." "People can surprise us, Lizzie," Jane said, smiling, "and sometimes those surprises can be quite pleasant. I posit he may have taken your words to heart and truly wishes to become a better man, not only for your sake, but for his own as well. Again, it is possible. But can a man's character really change so drastically in such a brief span of time?" "Love has a way of inspiring even the most stubborn of hearts," Jane replied, her eyes undoubtedly twinkling with the knowledge of her own blossoming romance. "And if Mr. Darcy's feelings for you are as strong as his actions suggest, then it is not so far-fetched to believe he would go to great lengths to prove himself worthy of your affections." Elizabeth sighed, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. She could not deny the thrill that coursed through her whenever Mr. Darcy's gaze lingered upon her, nor the way her heart raced at the sound of his voice. And yet, the memory of his past transgressions still cast a shadow over her thoughts, making it difficult to fully embrace the idea of his redemption, despite mounting evidence. "I confess I am at a loss as to how to proceed," Elizabeth admitted. "My feelings toward Mr. Darcy are as complex as the man himself, and I fear I may never fully understand either." Jane reached out and took her sister's hand, offering a reassuring squeeze. "Give it time, Lizzie. Allow yourself the opportunity to see Mr. Darcy for who he truly is, without the weight of past prejudices clouding your judgment. If his intentions are sincere, then perhaps you may find a love as wonderful as the one I have been blessed with." Chapter 6. One afternoon, Elizabeth was walking through the garden when Mr. Darcy approached, having followed the path from the stables. By his manner, he had purposely sought her out. "Miss Elizabeth," he said, bowing his head, "may I request the pleasure of walking with you?" What an odd question indeed for a gentleman who, having met her countless times in the lanes when they were in Kent, turned and walked with her, never once requesting permission. But she dared not dwell too hard on the matter. Instead she smiled and said, "Indeed you may, sir. It will be my pleasure as well." They fell into step without further comment. "I understand," he said at length, "that your father maintains an extensive collection of books." Elizabeth nodded. "It is Papa's chief pride, though I dare say many of the volumes are more prized for their familiarity than their literary merit. A comfort of long acquaintance should not be undervalued." She looked at him sidelong, uncertain if his remark held more meaning than it appeared. "You think so, sir?" "I do. There is something to be said for that which proves its worth over time." Again the quiet settled between them. Elizabeth coloured a little as she considered the import of Mr. Darcy's words. Could he be referring to the enduring nature of his own feelings toward her? The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she found herself unable to meet his gaze. As they continued their stroll, Mr. Darcy cleared his throat, drawing her attention once more. "Miss Elizabeth," he began, "I must confess that my purpose in seeking you out today was not merely to discuss your father's library." "And what, pray tell, was your purpose, Mr. Darcy? Surely you must know what a pleasure it is to me to accompany you on your walks. Despite how things ended between us in Kent, the frequency of our encounters on the lanes at Rosings Park were the making of my fondest memories with you. Your wit and insight never failed to captivate me." "You flatter me, Mr. Darcy. I am sure there are many young ladies in London who could provide far more stimulating conversation than I." "On the contrary," he replied, "I have yet to encounter a woman who can match your intelligence and vivacity. It is a rare and precious thing, Miss Elizabeth, and I find myself drawn to it like a moth to a flame." Elizabeth's heart raced as she met his gaze, seeing in his eyes a depth of feeling that both thrilled and frightened her. As they rounded a bend in the garden path, their hands brushed against each other's, sending a frisson through Elizabeth's body. Mr. Darcy's fingers lingered for a moment, as if reluctant to break the contact. The sound of approaching footsteps broke the spell, and they stepped apart, their cheeks flushed with the realization of what had transpired. Jane and Mr. Bingley emerged from the shrubbery, their faces alight with joy and laughter. "Lizzie! Mr. Darcy!" Jane exclaimed, her eyes darting between the two with a knowing glint. "What a pleasant surprise to find you both here. Charles and I were just discussing the possibility of a picnic by the pond. Would you care to join us?" Jane gasped. She coloured. "Mr. Bingley and I, that is to say." Elizabeth glanced at Mr. Darcy, and she could not help but smile. "A picnic sounds delightful, Jane. I am sure Mr. Darcy would be pleased to join us, would you not, sir?" Mr. Darcy, his composure regained, nodded his assent. "Indeed, Miss Bennet, it would be my pleasure to accompany you all on such a charming outing." As the four set off toward the pond, Elizabeth found herself close beside Mr. Darcy once more. The easy camaraderie that had developed between them during their earlier conversation persisted as they navigated the well-worn path. "I must say, Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Darcy remarked, "I find myself quite looking forward to this picnic. The company, in particular, promises to be most agreeable." Elizabeth laughed, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Why, Mr. Darcy, I do believe you are developing a taste for the simple pleasures of country life. Who would have thought that the great master of Pemberley would find such joy in a humble picnic?" "Perhaps it is not the picnic itself that brings me joy," he said, "but rather the opportunity to spend more time in the presence of those I hold dear." As they walked on, she allowed herself to bask in the glow of Mr. Darcy's affection, her earlier reservations slowly melting away in the face of his steady admiration. The picnic by the pond proved to be a delightful affair, filled with laughter, engaging conversation, and the pleasure of good company. As Elizabeth watched Jane and Mr. Bingley, their love for one another evident in every look and gesture, she found herself stealing glances at Mr. Darcy, wondering if perhaps their own story might one day mirror that of her sister and her beau. Inside the manor house, Mrs. Bennet was eagerly extolling the virtues of Derbyshire to her youngest daughter Lydia, who, much to her mother's chagrin, seemed more captivated by the latest fashions in bonnets than by the charms of distant counties. Yet Mrs. Bennet, undeterred by Lydia's inattentiveness, continued her monologue, her eyes frequently drifting toward the window where she could discern Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth engaged in congenial intercourse. "He is not so disagreeable as once I thought," Mrs. Bennet proclaimed with an assertiveness that belied her earlier judgments. "It is evident he possesses a vast fortune and enviable prospects. Indeed, what young lady would not be elated by the prospect of becoming the mistress of Pemberley?" With a delicate flutter of her fan, she continued, "And if his generosity matches his comeliness, I dare say he might prove to be quite the husband. Provided, of course, one can overlook his initial haughtiness." Her gaze wandered further along the garden path, where her eldest daughter Jane strolled in harmonious step with Mr. Bingley. "But then again, some gentlemen must be taught sense in their own good time," she mused, alluding to the protracted and, in her opinion, unnecessarily delayed courtship between Jane and Mr. Bingley, a situation that had tested her patience and fortitude. "What in heavens is he waiting for to make an offer to my poor Jane?" Mrs. Bennet pondered as she so often did when she was not asking the question aloud to all who would listen. As Mr. Bennet entered the room, his silent presence went unnoticed by his wife, who remained absorbed in her musings, yet his countenance revealed a mix of amusement and frustration, a fleeting expression of paternal wisdom, intertwined with the exasperation only a gentleman with a nervous wife of 23 years and 5 unmarried daughters could bestow. Riding alongside his friend Bingley later that evening, Darcy's thoughts lingered on the memories of Longbourn. The evening air was cool as their horses trotted steadily along the path. Darcy remained steadfast in his resolve, his exterior calmness masking the inner turmoil of his determined efforts. This quest had transcended mere revenge or the need for self-vindication. It had become a matter of profound necessity. Elizabeth must come to him willingly, with no doubts clouding her judgment. The unexpected surge of memories stirred by Hertfordshire had caught him off guard. Each visit to Longbourn was a stinging reminder of past mistakes, not only through her eyes, but also in the reflection of his own conscience. Yet uncertainty gnawed at him, even as he maintained the composed facade he had meticulously crafted to endure the emotions she had rekindled within him. "It is time, I think," Bingley said, his voice cutting through Darcy's introspection. "Time for what?" Darcy inquired, turning to observe his friend. The expression on Bingley's face conveyed all that needed to be said. "Are you saying you plan to offer Miss Bennet your hand in marriage?" "I pray you do not intend to sway me, especially considering your own feelings toward her sister," Bingley responded, a slight edge to his tone. "I have no intention of doing so. Would that I could have kept my opinions to myself from the start," Darcy admitted. "However, I will say your happiness is nearly guaranteed, as the young lady, and indeed her entire family, no doubt expects your proposal." Darcy's expression softened as he extended his hand toward his friend. "It is indeed my honour to be the first to wish you immense joy and boundless felicity." Accepting his friend's hand, Bingley smiled knowingly upon releasing it. "I believe," Bingley said with a mischievous glint in his eye, "that the only happiness that could exceed my own would be yours, should a certain lady return your affections in equal measure." Darcy shook his head, a rueful smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Alas, my friend, I fear that particular path is fraught with more obstacles than your own. Miss Elizabeth's opinion of me, while perhaps not as unforgiving as it once was, is still far from the ardent admiration I so desperately desire." "Patience, Darcy," Bingley advised, his voice filled with the wisdom of a man who had nearly lost his own chance at love. "If your feelings for Miss Elizabeth are as true and steadfast as I believe them to be, then surely she will come to see the depth of your devotion in time." As they rode on, the conversation turned to more light-hearted matters. Yet even as he laughed and jested with his friend, Darcy's thoughts never strayed far from Elizabeth, and the hope that one day she might come to love him as deeply as he loved her. Chapter 7. It was too fine a day for walking for any of the Bennet daughters to resist. The young ladies were all but out the door when Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy arrived on horseback, and so it was settled. The entire party would walk together as far as the next lane, at which point the younger girls would set off to a neighbouring village on their own. Darcy seldom spoke during the outing. It might have been the boisterous energy of Kitty and Lydia, with their girlish antics and infectious laughter, that caused his reticence. Elizabeth had grown used to this shade in his character, the way he seemed more like an observer than a participant. But today there was a shift in the air. Perhaps it was the way he deliberately adjusted his pace to match hers as the group spread out across the wider path. Or perhaps it was the moment she looked up and realized they were now trailing behind, left alone by the others' quicker strides. The quiet between them had lingered for too long and was growing unbearable, demanding to be broken. "I ought to thank you," she finally said. "You've been very obliging since your return. I know it cannot be easy." He turned to her, his eyes searching. "Why should it not be easy?" "Because of the things I said to you at Hunsford." Mr. Darcy's gaze held steady. "You spoke with honesty. I deserved nothing less." Elizabeth felt a tumult of surprise at his response. There was no bitterness, no wounded pride, just acceptance. "But I was mistaken," she confessed apologetically. "In many things." His silence in the wake of her speech encouraged her to say more. "I thought you insufferably proud. I thought you ungenerous. I thought—" She stopped, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Well, I thought what many people did." He glanced away then toward the open field beyond the hedgerow. "You believed what I allowed the world to see." Elizabeth slowed her steps. "I believe I see differently now." He looked into her eyes again. "Do you?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, taking in her response, and said nothing more. That very day, Mr. Bingley requested a private audience with Mr. Bennet, and Jane had been spirited away to the study. Mrs. Bennet wept with joy. Kitty clapped her hands. Lydia demanded to know when the wedding would be, and whether there would be officers in attendance. Mary, in an effort to contribute something solemn, offered a reading from Fordyce's sermons, which no one heard over Mrs. Bennet's exclamations. Elizabeth remained in the parlour, pretending to read while her attention lay fixed upon the closed door. When at last the door swung open and Bingley emerged, his countenance spoke volumes. Jane was by his side, her arm upon his, her composure only slightly marred by the trembling smile she could no longer contain. It was done. Mrs. Bennet cried out before she even heard the words, and rushed to embrace them both, her effusions loud and unrestrained. Elizabeth, for her part, was relieved and joyful beyond words. Her sister's happiness was secure at last, and it had not come about by accident. After all, she knew precisely who had worked behind the scenes to make this outcome possible. Unable to contain her emotions, Elizabeth slipped out into the hallway, for the general cheer inside the parlour had grown too loud for reflection. She had not expected to find Mr. Darcy there, near the window, looking out at the gardens, apparently in deep contemplation of his own. He turned when she approached, and for a moment neither spoke. Instead, their eyes locked in a wordless exchange of understanding. "I owe you a great deal," she said at last. "Were it not for your intervention, I do not think Mr. Bingley would have returned at all, much less found the courage to do what he has done today." Darcy bowed his head slightly. "You owe me nothing, Miss Elizabeth. Bingley is his own man, and I merely corrected an error in judgment which ought never to have occurred." She looked at him and allowed herself to embrace his tender regard. "You acted on your friend's behalf," she said, "but the benefit has fallen entirely on my family. I hope you know what a difference you have made." There was a pause. He looked out toward the garden, his brow furrowed in thought. "It was never my intention to injure Miss Bennet," he said, "but it is a source of great relief to me that any harm I caused may now be undone." Elizabeth studied his profile, struck again by the reserve in his features, the steadiness that once seemed haughty but now appeared only guarded. "I believe," she said after a moment, "that we, none of us, know how much we owe to you." He turned to her then, his eyes meeting hers fully. "Again, Miss Elizabeth, I am owed nothing. It is enough to see my friend content." She blushed, caught by the gravity of his tone. He saw it, and allowed himself the briefest moment of triumph, the satisfaction of seeing something he had set out to earn, her esteem. "I hope only that your sister's happiness will be enduring." Then as suddenly as that, Darcy stepped back, bowing his head in parting. "If you will excuse me." Elizabeth watched him retreat, something swelling in her chest. Hope ignited, perhaps, or something like it. As he disappeared into the next room, she let herself believe his confession that his feelings for her had not changed, that perhaps he might one day soon renew his proposal. She returned to the others, but her thoughts remained elsewhere. She felt she ought not to entertain such sentiments at a time like this, but they intruded nonetheless. Had I accepted Mr. Darcy's proposal when we were in Kent, I might very well know what my dearest Jane must surely be enjoying. I might know the pleasure of basking in my family's happiness for myself as much as their own selves, and against her reason, her will, and her better temperament, another persistent thought encroached on her busy mind. Was refusing Mr. Darcy's hand the greatest mistake of my life? Chapter 8. It was Lady Lucas's turn to call on Longbourn, bearing heartfelt congratulations for Jane, and no doubt her mother too. "You must be proud indeed, Mrs. Bennet," the visitor said, fanning herself, "and who knows? You may have more good news yet if what is being circulated is to be believed. Rumours are everywhere, you know." Mrs. Bennet, already flushed with triumph, leaned forward. "Rumours? About what?" "A very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbour to Mrs. Bennet," Lady Lucas said. "Only that another of your daughters may soon be very well settled. The neighbourhood is alive with speculation." Mrs. Bennet smiled knowingly. "Well, you did not hear this from me, but our Lizzie and Mr. Darcy have been spending prodigious time in each other's company." The visitor arched her brow. "You sound as though you mean to confirm such absurd rumours. I know your Jane made a most advantageous match with her Mr. Bingley, but in that case the gentleman could not be expected to do better, what with his fortune having its roots in trade. You can have no reason to suppose a gentleman of Mr. Darcy's consequence might subject himself to such an unequal alliance." Mrs. Bennet took umbrage at her neighbour's sentiments. "I know not what you mean. Mr. Darcy is a gentleman, and my Lizzie is a gentleman's daughter. That makes them equal." Lady Lucas offered a slight pitying smile. "Well, be that as it may, but I have it on good authority that Mr. Darcy is engaged to marry his cousin, Miss Anne de Bourgh." "If that were the case," Mrs. Bennet huffed, "then why would he be spending so much of his time in Hertfordshire?" Lady Lucas shrugged. "It most certainly is true. I heard by way of my son-in-law, Mr. Collins, that the engagement is of a peculiar kind, an arrangement from their births. It was the favourite wish of both their mothers, you see. Everyone assumes it is only a matter of time before the long-anticipated wedding takes place." At the mention of Mr. Collins, Mrs. Bennet stiffened inwardly, though she forced a well-rehearsed smile for the sake of appearances. She had never quite forgiven Lady Lucas, or her scheming daughter, for that despicable business last autumn. Why, everyone knew Mr. Collins had come to Longbourn expressly to choose a wife from among her 5 girls. Mrs. Bennet remained convinced that, had Charlotte Lucas not so artfully thrown herself in his way, what seemed like hours after her second eldest turned him away, he most certainly would have settled on Mary. Poor Mary! She would have been safely married by now, respectable and comfortably provided for, and Mrs. Bennet would spend the rest of her days in Longbourn, rather than be tossed out into the hedgerows as soon as Mr. Bennet died, as she frequently lamented. But no, the Lucases were always looking after their own interest first, no matter what smiles they wore. And now here was Lady Lucas again, stirring the pot with her hints and rumours, no doubt motivated by jealousy. Well, let her fume and mutter if she must, Mrs. Bennet thought with satisfaction, for her own family's triumphs were only just beginning. A far grander connection than anything the Lucases could boast of was soon to be secured, if certain present indications continued their happy course. Mrs. Bennet shook her head vigorously. "Then let them say what they will. Actions speak louder than family schemes, and I know what I see with my own eyes." While the conversation in the parlour continued, Elizabeth and Jane, returning from a walk, paused just beyond the open doorway. The hum of familiar voices reached them, Lady Lucas's in particular, pressing and persistent. Overhearing just enough of what Lady Lucas was saying, Jane caught Elizabeth's arm instinctively, both sisters exchanging astounded glances. Without a word, the two slipped quietly through the side door into the garden. They walked a few steps before Jane spoke. "Lizzie, do not let what we heard trouble you." Elizabeth forced a smile, but it faltered quickly. "How can it not trouble me? You heard her as clearly as I." Nodding, Jane said, "What is it that Lady Lucas meant by saying Mr. Darcy is engaged to marry his cousin, and it being an engagement of a peculiar nature, the favourite wish of their mothers? Surely that cannot be true. Surely it's only idle gossip. She took a deep, calming breath. All of Mr. Darcy's actions speak otherwise. Elizabeth said, "Of course it is untrue. Otherwise he would not have made an offer to me while in Kent. What Lady Lucas spoke of was but wishful thinking on the part of two sisters who did their parts in planning the union. Its execution depended entirely on others." Jane then expressed her concern for how this must bode for Elizabeth's felicity, were she to enter an alliance that went against Mr. Darcy's family's wishes, as it likely would. "From all I know of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, she would likely decry such a union as a disgrace, and declare that none of his family or friends will ever speak to him," Elizabeth said in a voice reminiscent of the grand ladies. "Oh, Lizzie, how would you endure such a daunting prospect?" "Those would be heavy misfortunes," replied Elizabeth. "But the wife of Mr. Darcy must have such extraordinary sources of happiness necessarily attached to her situation that she could, upon the whole, have no cause to repine." Jane begged her sister to be serious. Elizabeth released a deep sigh. "I dare not deny that Lady Lucas's words weigh on me, Jane. Our differences in fortune, in connections, and the expectations of society in general must surely press upon him." She trailed off, unwilling to give voice to the rest of the fear that gnawed at her heart. Jane squeezed her sister's hand. "Lizzie, do not allow yourself to believe the worst without cause. Remember how often others' assumptions have proven false before. Mr. Darcy's regard for you is not lightly given. You must have faith in that." Elizabeth turned her face to the soft breeze, letting it cool her heated cheeks. Her neighbour's suppositions had startled her, yes, but her heart, when she listened to it plainly, knew the truth. She had no fear of Mr. Darcy's constancy. Whatever expectations others might have placed upon him, he had made his feelings clear, and she would not doubt them now. All that remained was to wait, with patience, with hope, for the moment when he would choose to declare his sentiments once more. And when he did, Elizabeth would be ready. Chapter 9. If Mr. Darcy had learned anything from his previous mistakes, it was the necessity of patience. Elizabeth Bennet had become his constant thought. He had re-entered Hertfordshire, resolved never again to expose himself to the humiliation he had suffered at her hand, but equally determined to ensure she understood precisely what she had relinquished by refusing him. In the days following Jane Bennet's engagement, Darcy's presence at Longbourn became increasingly commonplace. His visits, accompanying Bingley ostensibly, offered ample opportunity to be in company with Elizabeth, to speak with her freely. His approach devoid of the compulsive pride that had once so disastrously marked his dealings with her, and it seemed to be working. Elizabeth's demeanour grew increasingly open in his presence. Her initial reserve gave way gradually to easiness, then trust, perhaps even admiration. She smiled more readily at his words, lingered longer in conversation, and held his gaze without the cautious reserve that had characterized their earlier meetings upon his arrival in that part of the country. One afternoon, when Darcy found himself alone with Elizabeth in Longbourn's east parlour, an arrangement not entirely accidental, he knew the time had come. "Miss Elizabeth," he began, "I have spent much time considering what I would say to you, should I ever be fortunate enough to find myself again at this point." Elizabeth looked into his eyes, her expression expectant yet tentative. "While in Kent," he continued, "I spoke with haste, with arrogance, and certainly with disregard for your feelings. You made your sentiments clear, and you were justified." She arched her brow, but she said nothing, waiting instead. "I will not repeat my mistakes," Darcy said. "You have taught me humility in a way no other person could. Have you forgiven me for my past transgressions?" Elizabeth hesitated, her colour rising. "Mr. Darcy," she said at last, "I have watched you closely since your return, and I have detected none of those perceived deficits in your character that earlier subjected you to my disapprobation. I know you stated your purposes soon after you arrived, but I had not expected to get to know the man who now stands before me." A sense of triumph stirred deep within him. He had proven his worth and earned from her the very response he sought. "I thank you, Miss Elizabeth," he said. "You have honoured me in a manner far more generous than I warrant, simply by allowing me to spend time with you, to better know the woman who now stands before me." Her eyes sparkled with genuine joy. "Perhaps, Mr. Darcy, we both have benefited from our time together." "Indeed," he said, offering her his hand. She placed her own lightly into his, and he gave it a tender squeeze, allowing himself the smallest moment of relief. His pride was appeased, his heart remained guarded. The victory, he told himself, was almost complete. As he stood beside her, his expression satisfied, Darcy reassured himself he had achieved precisely what he had returned to Hertfordshire to accomplish. Elizabeth Bennet was to be his wife, not from impulse, not from desperation, but because she now saw clearly what she had rejected. Yet somewhere beneath the satisfaction, the tumult in his mind would not be repressed. He had her regard, but what of her heart? What was more, had his objective taken on new meaning? Was it a matter of his winning her heart or his reclaiming his pride? Standing there before her, he was torn between certainty and doubt. He knew not how to think or how to feel. If I have not her heart, then what does it matter my pride? Miss Elizabeth, he said at length, I must ask. Is your new-found regard for me born only out of gratitude, or dare I wish for something more? Have I your heart? He gently clasped her hand in his once more. You are far too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings remain unchanged since last April, please tell me immediately. As I mentioned, upon my return, my affections and desires have remained constant. However, just one word from you will silence me on this matter forever. Elizabeth, grappling with an overwhelming sense of awkwardness and anxiety given the gravity of the moment, mustered the courage to speak. Her words tumbled out somewhat haltingly, yet they conveyed her feelings had transformed so significantly since the time he referenced that she now welcomed his assurances with the greatest delight. The joy that her response brought him was indescribable, an elation he likely had never experienced before. Darcy drew Elizabeth close, his hands caressing the small of her back as he gazed into her eyes with ardent intensity. "My dearest, loveliest Elizabeth," Darcy said, his voice low and thick with emotion. "You have bewitched me, body and soul. From this day forward I never wish to be parted from you again." Elizabeth trembled in his embrace. "Nor I from you," she whispered. Unable to restrain himself a moment longer, Darcy captured her lips in a tender kiss. Elizabeth melted against him, her lips parting eagerly beneath his as she wound her arms around his neck. In his mind, he kissed her with increasing fervour, years of pent-up longing unleashed in a flood of desire. His hands roamed her back, drawing her soft curves against the unyielding planes of his body. Elizabeth gave a sweet sound of pleasure, spurring his ardour. Darcy's mouth trailed heated kisses along her jaw, then down the graceful line of her neck, eliciting a moan from her lips. "Oh, Mr. Darcy," she whispered, "I love you." "As are you, Elizabeth," he replied, adoring the sensitive spot just below her ear. "I ache to make you mine in every way." Propriety and restraint crumbled as they lost themselves in each other's arms, hands caressing and stroking, stoking their mutual desire. Her fingers tangled in his hair as his mouth returned to hers, all in his eager mind. In practice, he kissed her tenderly, reverently, longingly, restraining all that burned beneath the surface. When at last they parted, both were breathless and flushed, their hearts pounding in unison. Darcy rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as he savoured the perfection of the moment. "Elizabeth," he said, "I have dreamed of holding you like this, of hearing you speak those words. Tell me this is not a dream from which I will cruelly awaken." Elizabeth smiled, her hand coming up to caress his cheek. "It is no dream, Fitzwilliam. This is real, and my love for you is true and everlasting." Darcy captured her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing her palm with aching tenderness. "I am the most fortunate of men to have earned your affections. I vow to devote my life to your happiness, Elizabeth. You shall want for nothing." "I already have everything I could ever want," she whispered. "I have you." Her words only encouraged his ardour, and soon enough their lips met again and again. Lost in their passionate ministrations, Darcy's hands roamed Elizabeth's curves with growing boldness, caressing her through the thin muslin of her gown. She shivered and pressed herself closer. This was enough to recall him to their present circumstances. Tearing themselves apart, both were left gasping and trembling with barely leashed need. Darcy drew a deep breath, fighting to regain some semblance of control. "Forgive me," he said. "I let myself get carried away in the moment." "There is nothing to forgive," Elizabeth assured him, "for I am just as eager as you. But perhaps we should rejoin the others before we are missed." "Of course," he agreed, easing away but keeping her hands clasped in his. "We must tread carefully to protect your reputation, but I long for the day when I may show you the full depths of my ardour without restraint. Until they were wed, however, they must behave with the utmost discretion." With effort they collected themselves and returned to the parlour, presenting a composed facade despite the yearning that still coursed through their veins, awakened sensibilities that only their newly formed understanding could bring. Elizabeth, unaware of the careful boundaries Darcy had drawn around himself, was swept along by the promise of their future felicity. To her this was love anew, past misgivings erased. She neither doubted the sincerity of the man beside her, nor questioned his intentions. Her heart was fully committed, her trust freely given, and she could not have been happier. Chapter 10. 2 months later. With 2 daughters married, one to the amiable Mr. Bingley and the other to the formidable Mr. Darcy of Pemberley, Mrs. Bennet had little cause to complain and every reason to boast. That the ceremonies had passed without mishap, that her nerves had not overwhelmed the occasion, and that so many relations and neighbours had borne witness to her success in securing not 1 but 2 excellent sons-in-law. These were reflections she meant to enjoy for many days to come. Indeed, while the wedding breakfast guests lingered over the feast, felicitations and farewells, Mrs. Bennet was heard to remark that her work was most assuredly done, for now her other girls were sure to be thrown into the paths of wealthy gentlemen themselves. For Elizabeth the wedding day passed in a blur. There was much to occupy her thoughts, much to hope for, yet she could not help but notice Mr. Darcy's composure, gracious, yet ever so slightly distant. She attributed this to his natural reserve, a temperament she understood might require patience on her part to understand fully. The days following their wedding were spent in pleasant travel, allowing the newlyweds to become better acquainted in relative privacy. Their journey carried them through some of England's most picturesque countryside, first through Oxfordshire, then onward to the quiet beauty of Shropshire, and finally into the rolling hills of Devonshire. In Shropshire they lingered at modest inns, where the innkeepers received them with polite curiosity tempered by reverence. Elizabeth, eager to discover more of her new husband's true character, often engaged him in conversations about their surroundings, purposefully drawing him out to reveal his tastes and opinions. There was so much more about this man with whom she now shared her life, and she, being the self-proclaimed studier of people's character, did not want to miss a thing. "Have you visited this village before?" Elizabeth asked one afternoon, gazing curiously at a quaint dwelling they passed. "I have, though it was many years ago," Darcy replied. He glanced briefly toward her, offering a smile. "It seems more welcoming now." "No doubt a consequence of your being here with me," she said teasingly. "Indeed, without a doubt, Mrs. Darcy." "I love it when you call me Mrs. Darcy. Pray, do you find married life to your liking thus far, Mr. Darcy?" He paused. "I find myself most fortunate," he said at length. Elizabeth smiled, pleased by his words even if they were spoken with characteristic reserve. In the days that followed she sought to draw Mr. Darcy out further, engaging him in spirited conversation and playful encouragement as they continued their journey. "Is this not the most enchanting place, Fitzwilliam?" she asked. "I feel as though we have stepped into a fairy tale." Darcy met her gaze, his expression softening as he took in the glow of happiness upon her face. "Any place would seem a paradise, so long as I am with you," he replied. She reached out and took his hand in hers, interlacing their fingers. "I feel the same, my love. Being by your side makes even the simplest pleasures seem extraordinary." "Like the kiss of a rose on a summer's day," Darcy said, waxing poetic. Elizabeth's heart fluttered at his words. "My love, you have quite a way with pretty speeches when you put your mind to it." "What can I say, other than that you bring out the very best in me?" "Do I indeed? I can scarcely wait to hear what I inspire in you next. Or do you mean to leave me guessing?" "Mrs. Darcy," he began, "I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours." Smiling, Elizabeth could not help but recall the first time he had uttered those words to her. It was during their first dance ever at the Netherfield ball. Then she had considered them intimidation. Now they were akin to a promise, a most blissful promise at that. Every night of their journey concluded in a familiar pattern. The newlyweds, wrapped in the tender embrace of fresh love, did exactly what new lovers in the throes of discovery are wont to do, exploring the newfound depths of their relationship with eager curiosity. However, each time Darcy rose from the bed, he bid her a respectful good night with words that left Elizabeth silently questioning. Albeit satiated in ways she had never dreamed possible, she puzzled over his restraint, wondering what lay beneath it. One night, however, Darcy did not rise after their lovemaking. Instead, he drifted into sleep beside her, his breathing steady and deep. Elizabeth lay awake, scarcely daring to move, watching the rise and fall of his bare chest in the faint moonlight. A rush of tenderness filled her, along with something she could not easily name. How rare, how precious to have him so near without pretense or defence. Her heart swelled with affection, though a tender ache stirred within her. If he could fall asleep by her side without restraint tonight, why not every night? Chapter 11. Upon their arrival in Pemberley Woods some weeks later, Elizabeth's mind was too full for conversation, but her eyes missed nothing. They gradually ascended for half a mile and then found themselves at the top of a considerable eminence, where the wood ceased and Pemberley House came into view, situated on the opposite side of a valley, into which the road with some abruptness wound. It was a large, handsome stone building standing well on rising ground, and backed by a ridge of high, woody hills. In front, a stream of some natural importance was swelled, but without any artificial appearance. Its banks were neither formal nor falsely adorned. Elizabeth was delighted. Such picturesque wonders as this were her fascination, and she had never seen a place for which nature had done more, or where natural beauty had been so little counteracted by an awkward taste. Were she to utter such effusions aloud, her husband must surely think her mercenary, but there were sentiments to be suffered that bore a measure of pride. Indeed, of this place I am its mistress. Turning toward Darcy, her eyes shone with undisguised admiration. I am beginning to understand your attachment to this place, she said. It would appear the fates have conspired to show my home, our home to its greatest advantage, Darcy replied, holding her eyes longer than usual, allowing Elizabeth a fleeting sense of the affection she so keenly hoped for. As the carriage crested the final rise, Elizabeth caught sight of the house fully, its grand stone facade framed by towering trees, the stream gleaming just beyond. But her attention was soon drawn not to the building itself, but to the assembled figures waiting before it. The full household staff had gathered in formal attendance, arrayed in 2 neat rows along the drive. The butler stood at the centre, dignified and motionless, flanked by the housekeeper and senior footman. Behind them, an army of servants held their positions with rigid discipline. Their attire was immaculate, their faces composed. The carriage rolled to a stop. A footman moved swiftly to open the door. Darcy stepped out first, his expression unreadable but not unfeeling. He turned and extended his hand to Elizabeth. As her gloved fingers met his, she descended with all the poise of a young bride seeing her home for the first time. Elizabeth's eyes passed over the assembled faces, curious yet reverent. She felt the weight of 100 unsaid observations. This was no family gathering, no jubilant celebration. She was being seen, she was being measured. Darcy's voice cut through the stillness. Mrs. Darcy. He did not turn to her, but the words were clearly meant for all to hear. Mistress of Pemberley. The butler bowed. Welcome home, madam. A ripple of bows and curtsies followed. Perfectly timed. Elizabeth nodded. Thank you. I am very pleased to be here. Only then did Darcy offer her his arm and guide her forward, up the stone steps, through the open doors, and into the life that now lay before them. The entrance hall of Pemberley was bright with late afternoon light filtering through the glass above the door. A footman stood ready to close the doors behind them, and the hush of the assembled staff gave way to purposeful movement as coats and gloves were collected. Elizabeth took in her surroundings with glee. The black and white marble floor gleamed underfoot. The massive staircase seemed to extend to the heavens above. Darcy did not release his wife's arm as they were led forward. The butler, Mr. Langley she recalled, escorted them into a very pretty sitting-room where refreshments had been prepared. A light repast has been laid out in accordance with Mr. Darcy's instructions, he said in a formal tone, directed more to Elizabeth than to his master. The housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, awaits your pleasure afterward, should you wish to be shown through the principal rooms." "Thank you, Mr. Langley," Elizabeth said. "That will be quite satisfactory." 2 chairs had been arranged near the window. Darcy remained standing until Elizabeth was seated. She took her place, though she felt her breath catch slightly as her skirt settled against the cushion. The fine porcelain china rattled faintly as she lifted her cup, a delicate sound so unlike the hearty clatter of her mother's tea service at Longbourn, where conversation was loud and manners less refined. She was a long way from Longbourn. Across from her, Darcy, now seated, watched, not critically, but with an attentiveness she could not read. "Everything appears just as I remember it," he said, reaching for his own cup. "I imagine it has changed little." He agreed. "But the purpose of the place has changed. No longer a house, but a home. That makes a considerable difference." Elizabeth looked down at her tea, unsure of how to reply. The newlyweds sat for a while in companionable silence, each no doubt entertaining visions of what the coming days might bring. Elizabeth, after allowing her gaze to sweep slowly about the room, marvelled at the thought. How amazing indeed to be mistress of such a place. Their first days at Pemberley were filled with polite introductions and explorations of the estate. Darcy himself often led Elizabeth through the grand halls and intimate chambers, always solicitous, always attentive yet carefully guarded in his manner. He asked for her opinions on household arrangements, responded thoughtfully to her suggestions, and praised her instincts with intention. And yet Elizabeth increasingly felt a peculiar isolation. The man she married and had supposed she had come to know so well was but the surface. She had never seen him in these circumstances before, not truly. The first time in Hertfordshire he had been a haughty guest at Netherfield Park. In Kent he had been a guest of his noble relation, unknown to herself, an admirer. His next time in Hertfordshire, an ardent suitor, and throughout their wedding journey a passionate lover. But here at Pemberley he was something else entirely, wholly at ease in his role as master. The staff addressed him with unfailing respect, and he responded in kind, but without the formality that marked his behaviour in town. Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper, had sung Mr. Darcy's praises to Elizabeth the first chance she could, declaring, "He is the best landlord and the best master that ever lived, not like the wild young men nowadays, who think of nothing but themselves. There is not one of his tenants or servants but will give him a good name. Some people call him proud, but I am sure I never saw anything of it. To my fancy, it is only because he does not rattle away like other young men." Perhaps, Elizabeth thought, it was the demands of such a grand estate, the expectation of composure, the centuries of stewardship that shaped him so. He had been absent from this place for many months. That he should now return not alone but with a wife must have unsettled more than just his routine. Darcy's courtesy was flawless, but his reserve was more severe. Despite this, there were moments, brief but deeply comforting, when she felt certain of his affection. A gentle glance across the dinner table, a soft touch as he handed her into a carriage, each instance fortified her hope. One evening, as they stood together gazing over the moonlit gardens, Elizabeth gathered her courage. "Mr. Darcy, when you asked me a second time to be your wife, did you fear I might refuse again?" Startled by her forthrightness, he turned to look at her. "I dare to hope, Elizabeth. My greatest fear was not your refusal, but that you might accept without truly wishing it." Elizabeth's breath caught. "You need never doubt my sincerity, Fitzwilliam. My acceptance was heartfelt." His eyes searched hers before his expression once more became guarded. "Then consider me the most contented of men." He withdrew, bidding her good night with his usual politeness. Elizabeth watched him leave, her heart simultaneously encouraged by his words and troubled by the distance he maintained. She resolved anew to be patient, determined that her steadfast affection would, in time, overcome his cautious reserve. Behind closed doors, Darcy stood alone in the calm of his study, the fire low, the house newly stilled around him. He loved Elizabeth, of that he had no doubt, and their life together thus far had brought unexpected joy. Yet the ease of their companionship could not allay the part of him that remained guarded, the part still nursing the piercing injury from the dagger she had driven into him that night at the parsonage. "You could not have made the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Before meeting Elizabeth, he would never have dared to express his sentiments so candidly to another. His mother, admired by all and remembered fondly, had shown him too clearly the cost of displaying one's heart without protection. He had learned, early and thoroughly, that affection unguarded could give way to pain. The honeymoon period, if it could still be called that, need not end, but neither could it be trusted without caution. He had no time for such reflections. Better that he turned his thoughts toward the duties ahead, where certainty still reigned and feelings could remain for now safely kept. Chapter 12. If not for the consolation of frequent letters from her family and friends, Elizabeth would surely be beside herself, for her connection with her family had always been grounded in the intimacy afforded by proximity. On that particular day, Elizabeth refolded Jane's letter and placed it on the writing desk, her fingers lingering a moment on the neatly written script. A sigh escaped her lips as she leaned back in her chair, gazing absently through the nearby window. Her sister's words, filled with glowing praise and unreserved delight, echoed in her mind. By Jane's account, marriage was a state of perpetual joy, an effortless communion of souls. Mr. Bingley, she wrote, was kindness personified, endlessly attentive, overflowing with affectionate words and thoughtful deeds. Elizabeth could almost see Jane's serene smile, the gentle radiance that her elder sister wore so naturally. Yet Elizabeth knew Jane. Jane saw the world bathed in a benevolent glow, perceiving virtue even where it was faintest. Bingley, by nature, was amiable and open, eager to please and quick to smile. His affections were uncomplicated, freely given and utterly transparent. Such simplicity suited Jane perfectly, and Elizabeth felt genuine happiness for her sister's fortune. On reflecting upon Jane and Bingley, Elizabeth often supposed there could have never been two hearts so open, no tastes so similar, no feelings so in unison, no countenances so beloved. But Darcy was no Bingley. Where Bingley was sunlight, warm and bright, Darcy was moonlight, cool and veiled, revealing his depths only to those who lingered long enough to see. Elizabeth smiled, her gaze drifting across the lush grounds of Pemberley, vivid and tranquil beneath the afternoon sun. Jane's happiness was infectious, yet Elizabeth knew herself well enough to recognise that the same open-hearted, unfailingly cheerful devotion that Bingley possessed would not satisfy her own heart. There was an allure, a quiet fascination, in the complexities of the man she'd married, a depth and mystery that challenged her, engaged her intellect, and stirred her emotions in ways simple amiability could never hope to match. She rose slowly, her fingers idly tracing the edge of the letter once more, before leaving it to rest upon the desk. Turning toward the window, Elizabeth whispered, "As dearly as I love you, Jane, and indeed I cherish Mr. Bingley for the happiness he brings you. I would not love my husband half so well, had he your husband's temperament. It is precisely because of the man Fitzwilliam is, that my heart is his entirely." A fortnight slipped by each day marked by shared meals, leisurely strolls through the gardens, and occasional rides across the rolling verdant expanses of Pemberley. Elizabeth gradually eased into her new role, her comfort growing with each passing day. She smiled more readily at the servants, her gestures sincere and kind, while a genuine affection blossomed between her and Georgiana, who had recently arrived from the bustling heart of London to join the tranquillity of life with the Darcys. As Darcy observed these tender interactions, a quiet satisfaction settled within him, allowing himself moments of brief but heartfelt smiles that Elizabeth came to cherish. One morning, Darcy and Elizabeth strolled through the gardens, the air fragrant with the sweetness of the surrounding blooms. Elizabeth stole occasional glances toward her husband, noting the graceful, confident manner in which he carried himself, and wished for a glimpse into the inner workings of his mind. At length, as was her wont to do, she broke the silence. "You spoke once, Fitzwilliam, of my making Pemberley brighter. Do you find that hope realised?" Darcy paused, turning to regard her intently. "Far beyond my expectations," he replied. "Sometimes, I confess, I fear myself too forward, perhaps too intrusive into your sombre ways." He shook his head. "You could never intrude, Elizabeth." He hesitated, then shifted the subject. "I wonder if the household's management occupies too much of your schedule. Have you found ample leisure to enjoy your days? She recognised the diversion for what it was, though. She could not help but be disappointed. Patience, she reminded herself, believing that the deep understanding she longed for would come with time. Indeed, Pemberley offers countless diversions. Georgiana has been delightful company. Her talent at the pianoforte quite outshines my own, I fear. She took a breath. But as I do not practice nearly as much as her, I dare not complain. Georgiana benefits from your companionship, Darcy replied. You have a unique talent for drawing out the best in those around you. Elizabeth coloured at the compliment. I thank you for such kind words, sir. You must know how dearly I hope to be an agreeable mistress to Pemberley, and a fitting companion to its master. Darcy looked at her for a moment, as if weighing a response, but said nothing. His expression remained kind, but just out of reach. Encouraged, yet not quite reassured, Elizabeth let the moment pass. She had always taken pride in her discernment. She had read widely, formed strong opinions, and imagined herself better prepared than most to meet the challenges of life beyond Longbourn. But she had not fully accounted for the daily labour of being mistress of Pemberley. No book in her father's library had explained how to earn the steady confidence of staff who had served the Darcy family for decades, nor how to judge matters of estate management with the same assurance Darcy seemed to summon effortlessly. She had leaned more heavily on Mrs. Reynolds, grateful for the housekeeper's guidance, but chafing at her own inexperience. She knew how she must appear, a clever country girl now learning in earnest that cleverness alone was not command. There were times, particularly when Darcy's praise felt distant or lacking, when she hardly recognised herself. Is this what love has brought me to? Elizabeth wondered. This persistent yearning for my husband's approbation? Her confidence had not vanished, but it had been softened, reshaped by love into something more tentative. Darcy himself wrestled with conflicting emotions. Each evening spent in Elizabeth's engaging presence challenged his determination to shield his heart from further vulnerability. Her intelligence, wit, and genuine charms were slowly but undeniably eroding his carefully constructed defences. More than once, in moments alone, he found himself yearning to confess his deepest sentiments, only to draw back, reminding himself of the bitter sting of wearing one's heart on one's sleeve. Despite this hard-learned lesson, etched in his very being, Darcy's mind raced with the implications of lowering his guard, of allowing Elizabeth to see the scars that marred his heart. Would she recoil from the intensity of his feelings, or would she embrace them with the same ardour that burned within his own breast? The uncertainty was both thrilling and terrifying, a precipice from which he longed to leap, yet feared the fall. One evening, as they sat reading before the drawing-room fire, Elizabeth looked up from her book, her eyes searching Darcy's countenance. The soft crackle of the fire filled the room, the only sound besides the turning of pages. "Fitzwilliam, might I ask a question?" "Of course," he replied, setting aside his own book and turning to face her. She hesitated before continuing, but continue she must. "Do you regret any part of our marriage? Has it met with all your hopes?" "Regret has no place in my thoughts, Elizabeth." Elizabeth's fingers fiddled with the pages of her book as her eyes searched his. "Yet you seem sometimes guarded, as though holding part of yourself at bay. I wonder, does some fear linger between us?" He paused, not because he lacked words, but because he had too many. Fear, no. Caution, perhaps. "I know I should be better at this. You must forgive me. My nature inclines toward reserve." Yes, I know," she admitted, her smile wavering between relief and uncertainty. His answer was flawed, and a part of her found comfort in that. Elizabeth accepted his words, deciding to cherish the sincerity he offered, rather than lamenting what had gone unsaid. Yet the ache lingered, subdued but insistent, a yearning for closeness that polite conversation could not quite satisfy. Chapter 13. One evening, Elizabeth found herself alone in the drawing-room at the pianoforte, her fingers moving idly over the keys, producing soft, reflective notes. Darcy had entered the room and paused by the doorway. She detected him watching her intently, his usually guarded expression softened by sincere admiration, causing her to wonder how long he had been standing there. Elizabeth turned slightly, pleased by his silent presence. "You surprised me," she said softly, her eyes bright with pleasure. "Pray, come sit with me. Will you choose a piece for me to play?" Darcy moved nearer and he selected a sheet of music from the nearby stand. Their fingers brushed as he offered her the sheet, his touch brief, but not careless. He did not draw back at once. The warmth of her skin lingered. For one dizzying instant he thought only of how natural it felt. "This has always been one of my favourites," he said. "Oh, I am familiar with this." Touched by his choice, she continued, "It is indeed beautiful." He lingered close, rather than sit, standing just behind her as she played. The soft notes filled the air. Darcy allowed himself to savour the moment. She turned on the bench, looking up at him. Her pulse quickened, though her hands remained still in her lap. His scent, fresh and clean, sandalwood and spice, flooded her senses. "I wonder at your thoughts," she said. After a pause, he said, "My thoughts are simpler than you imagine, Elizabeth. Born of gratitude for your presence here in my home, our home." "Gratitude is not affection, Fitzwilliam." He stiffened before recovering quickly. "Affection, Elizabeth, can take many forms." Even if kindly intended, his words rang hollow to her ears. Her brow arched, she said, "That is some consolation, I suppose." Darcy offered a somewhat apologetic smile before he withdrew from the room. Alone again, Elizabeth remained seated at the pianoforte, her fingers tracing the keys absently as her mind drifted. She reflected upon Darcy's words and demeanour, puzzling over the careful distance he seemed determined to maintain. Try as she might, she could not help but recall a peculiar correspondence she had received that day, its sender being even more so. The letter read, "Hunsford, near Westerham, Kent. My dear cousin Elizabeth, I write to you not as a clergyman, but rather as your relation and, dare I say, your well-wisher in all matters, both moral and matrimonial. Imagine my surprise when, in the ordinary and entirely innocent course of retrieving correspondence addressed to my esteemed wife, I happened upon a letter which, though addressed to Mrs. Collins, I interpreted, quite naturally, as a confidential entreaty directed to me. For how else might I explain your candid reflections, your evident concern, and your most earnest tone, unless you had hoped, perhaps unconsciously, for my insight? Allow me then to reassure you that your blessed union with Mr. Darcy, despite the challenges posed by his brooding disposition, is not without hope. I have it on the best authority, my own observations during my visit to Rosings, that he is a man of principle, though deficient in the lively manners that so recommend a husband to his wife in the early weeks of matrimony. That you find him guarded, aloof, and at times somewhat severe is not surprising in a man of so elevated a station. Blessed, in a peculiar way, with everything the heart of mortal can most desire, splendid property, noble kindred, and extensive patronage. Greatness often wears a solemn face, however, you must not be discouraged. Many a gentleman has been fashioned by the patient guidance of a proper wife. You need only look to my noble patroness, the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, as an example of feminine fortitude. Though her daughter speaks but seldom and with little force, her ladyship exerts significant influence in every domestic arrangement. I would urge you, dear cousin, as Lady Catherine no doubt would have, should she have reconciled herself to your situation, to adopt a similar posture to that which Mr. Bourgh would have had she assumed what so many deemed her rightful place, silent, humble, and ever attentive to your husband's superior judgment. The letter went on to say more, much more than Elizabeth could at present recall. But its closing was not something she would forget. Should you find yourself in need of further instruction, you must not hesitate to write again, whether directly or, as before, by way of a letter to my wife. I shall, as ever, be ready to interpret your needs and answer them with all due propriety. Your faithful cousin and most attentive guide, William Collins. Caught in a whirlwind of emotions, Elizabeth found herself torn between laughter and tears. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a deep breath as she shook her head in disbelief. Am I so desperate that I'm giving credence to the ramblings of Mr. Collins? Yet a part of her wondered if there was something more to his words, leaving her even more concerned about her present state of mind. Chapter 14. As days turned into weeks at Pemberley, Elizabeth grew ever more aware of a troubling shift in her relationship with Darcy. They maintained outward harmony, sharing pleasant conversations and unhurried evenings, Yet beneath this picture of domestic felicity lay a measure of tension. There was a part of her, though she would never admit it aloud, that dreaded his silence. Silence could not be reasoned with, it simply endured. His cold politeness, his ceremonious grace were worse than anything. She recalled how, in their early days, he had lingered at her side, even in silence, how one glance across the room had been enough to enthrall her. Lately he seemed to vanish behind his own wall of indifference. One evening, after dinner had concluded and the household had settled, Elizabeth found Darcy alone in his study, leaning over his desk deep in thought. She hesitated at the threshold, taking in the sight of him before knocking on the open door. Darcy looked up, his eyes softening as he saw her. "Elizabeth," he said, "to what do I owe this pleasure?" He had almost smiled, almost. The tenderness in his eyes had appeared, just for an instant, and then gone. Elizabeth stepped further into the room, hoping against hope he might meet her halfway. She was beginning to liken hope to little more than a wound of one's own making. "I merely sought your company," she replied. "It seems we have spent so little time together, at least in private." "I apologize if my attentions have seemed inadequate. I have been preoccupied with state matters." Elizabeth moved closer, standing just a few feet from him. "I understand your responsibilities are demanding, Fitzwilliam, but as your wife, I might help to ease some of your burdens, if you would but allow it." A faint line appeared between his brows, as though weighing words more than feelings. "Your consideration does you great credit, Elizabeth. However, I would not wish to burden you." She drew a steady breath, stepping even closer. "It would be no burden to me. I wish for nothing more than to share in all aspects of your life, your cares as well as your joys." Darcy regarded her for a long moment. He sighed and looked away before turning back to her. "You're very kind, Elizabeth," he began, "but some matters are best managed alone." Her chest tightened. Unwilling to concede so easily as that, she reached out, touching his hand. "Fitzwilliam, we are married now. Should we not face our burdens together?" He looked down at her hand resting on his own, but after a moment's hesitation, he withdrew, stepping back to place more distance between them. "Your kindness and understanding are more than I deserve," he said. "There is no cause for concern." Elizabeth felt her heart ache at his retreat. It bore no bitterness, no sharpness. It was gentle, and worse for being so. It was the same gentleness she had used on her youngest sisters, when steering them from disappointment, and in this instance it wounded more than any harsh word could have. "Perhaps you underestimate my strength," she said. Darcy hesitated again. At length he said, "You mistake me, Elizabeth. My intention is never to underestimate your worth or your strength. You are far dearer to me than you know, and for that I am grateful." His words, meant as reassurance, only heightened her dismay. "I suppose gratitude is better than indifference," she said. Darcy flinched at her words. His mouth opened, but no reply came. When he could, he said, "Elizabeth, my gratitude is sincere. Please trust that my caution is born from a wish to protect you." "From what, Fitzwilliam?" she asked. "From you, or from myself?" The words were not meant to be spoken aloud, but frustrated people did not always refrain from speaking their mind. Darcy made no reply, his silence speaking volumes as he met her gaze before turning away. "I think perhaps it is growing late," he said. "Rest well, Elizabeth." With a respectful nod he withdrew from the room, leaving Elizabeth alone in the soft glow of the candlelight. She stood motionless for several moments, her heart heavy with a new realization. The man who had once professed himself so passionately in love now withheld even the simplest affection. For the first time since their marriage, Elizabeth doubted her place in his heart. And yet, she could not bring herself to stop hoping. Not yet. She had come too far for that. Pride might force her to retreat, but something else, something stubborn, rooted her in place. Chapter 15. The Darcys' evenings unfolded with certain routine. One reading, the other writing, their words seldom straying beyond bare pleasantries. And though no quarrel had arisen between them, a silence prevailed which she could neither define nor dismiss. His presence had once stirred her pulse. Now it merely stirred questions. Had she known or even suspected the loneliness that awaited her in becoming his wife, she was all but certain she would have chosen differently. Her father's words when he bestowed his blessings could not help but intrude. I have given him my consent. He is the kind of man indeed to whom I should never dare refuse anything, which he condescended to ask. I now give it to you, if you are resolved on having him. But let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know you could be neither happy nor respectable, unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. My child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. You know not what you are about. She had dismissed her father's warning then, believing herself the exception. She had smiled too easily, too certain she knew her own heart. But hindsight is not foresight, and neither is it insight, she considered. I made my choice, and must now live with it. Part of her compared her situation to that of others, her dear friend Charlotte's, with Mr. Collins in particular, and reasoned she had little cause to repine. Being the wife of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley was not without its advantages. There were those to be found in the bedroom especially, and Elizabeth was sure she would not wish to trade places with anyone in that regard. His tender ministrations at such times were not merely perfunctory, meant only to secure the Darcy lineage. There at least he was affectionate, attentive, and, it must be said, generous to a fault. But is it too much to expect the pleasure of being held in one's husband's arms throughout the night? She had told herself it was the nature of a new union, that his temperament demanded time. After all, she had once accused him of pride. Was it not possible that old habits required patience to unlearn? And yet each moment he turned away from tenderness she suffered the pain more deeply. It was not indifference, it was something else, and therein lay her unease. I, who once prided myself on my independence, now ache for what he will not offer. One afternoon, as Elizabeth and Georgiana walked through the gardens together, the latter said, "You seem miles and miles away, Elizabeth. Is anything troubling you?" Georgiana's gaze lingered. "Forgive me, I did not mean to pry," she added. "Only I know my brother well, and I know how reticent he can be at times. I imagine such a temperament must be difficult to endure." Elizabeth offered no immediate reply, only a faint smile as they turned back toward the manor house. Though her heart tightened at the honest inquiry, at length Elizabeth said, "It is nothing of importance, I assure you," here she sighed. "Only a little weariness, perhaps." She took Georgiana by the hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. She said, "You must not concern yourself with such matters." How ironic that these words should come from her, words oddly akin to her husband's advice to her. Indeed, she was far more accustomed to offering reassurance than receiving it. Yet as they continued to walk, Elizabeth felt Georgiana's questioning eyes still upon her, and wondered if the young woman saw more than she intended. The heartache of isolation is not so easily disguised as I supposed. A single candle burned low beside Elizabeth's chair. Though her book lay open, her eyes had not moved across the lines in several minutes. She heard his footsteps in the corridor and stiffened. Elizabeth flipped through the pages of her book, pretending to read. Darcy entered, his presence commanding and yet, as always, restrained. "Elizabeth," he said, "you seem troubled. Is there something I might assist you with?" She hesitated, her eyes meeting his, searching for some sign, some reassurance that their affection for each other was not lost. He saw it, her hesitation, as though speaking would require some great effort on her part, and for a moment he wanted to meet her fully, to unguard the words he had long buried. But even now, with her so near, he could not let himself cross the line. Years of discipline had taught him how to withstand such temptations. He would not break. At length, Elizabeth said, "I find myself uncertain, Fitzwilliam. There is something missing between us, some intimacy or understanding I cannot name." "I regret you feel this way, Elizabeth," he replied. "My intentions have always been honourable." "I do not doubt your honour," she replied, "but honour is not affection, nor does it provide the closeness I once thought we might share. You speak of intimacy and understanding. Have I failed so in your expectations?" Elizabeth asked, "Am I at fault, Fitzwilliam? Did I misjudge your affections during our courtship and assume too much?" "You refused me once, Elizabeth. Did you think I would forget?" The room fell still. The fire hissed in the grate, a log shifting into ash. Elizabeth's face did not change, but her eyes lowered, first in disbelief, then with understanding. She turned away, not in a dramatic gesture, but to spare herself the full force of his expression. He had not meant to say it, she knew that, but he had said it. She had no defence prepared for this, only the dignity of not replying. The cut was too clean for outrage. The harsh truth his words revealed, the illusion shattered, leaving behind a stark clarity. She realised at that moment that his guarded civility, his distance, had never been a product of temperament. It was, in fact, intentional, a deliberate withholding of the affection she sought. The deafening quiet ensued, devoid of the fierce rebuttal the moment warranted. Darcy looked away. His jaw tightened. "Forgive me," he said at last. "That was unfair, but perhaps, Elizabeth, some wounds do not heal so easily as we would wish." Elizabeth rose, feeling a profound shift within her heart. "I understand," she replied. "I see now that my mistake was not in misjudging your affections, but in believing you would put any lingering anguish from Hunsford behind." A cold, painful certainty settled within her. She no longer hoped for intimacy where there was none. Making her way along the carpeted floor, she did not look back. The corridor felt colder than she remembered, the flickering sconces blurring in her vision. She thought of the first time she had seen Darcy at the Meryton Assembly, the man who had once called her barely tolerable, and how far they had come only to arrive at such distance again. Alas, she accepted it. Her hopes had not merely dimmed, they had vanished, and in its place only detachment remained, embittered and now hers to command. Chapter 16. The days following their painful confrontation settled into an uneasy rhythm. The corridors of Pemberley, once full of potential and promise, now echoed with a kind of emptiness that Elizabeth had never expected to find in marriage. She moved through the halls as though a guest rather than mistress. The grand house, so admired on her first visit, now seemed just a house, albeit a magnificent one, but no longer a home. Darcy observed her withdrawal with growing unease. He had believed, when he orchestrated her acceptance, that mastery over his feelings would protect him from further pain, that offering her comfort, wealth, and esteem without the risk of emotional exposure was the safest path. But control, once a shield, now chafed like ill-fitting armour. He had everything he told himself he needed. Why, then, was he more discontented with each passing day? Evenings were especially poignant. Elizabeth no longer sought conversation, no longer cast hopeful glances in his direction. Instead, she contented herself with her books or needlework. She lingered longer over her correspondence, reread novels, and turned more to Georgiana for conversation. She had ceased trying to draw Darcy out, no doubt supposing what would have been the point. One evening, Darcy entered the drawing-room. Elizabeth sat near the fire, her embroidery laid forgotten in her lap, her eyes fixed upon the bright flames in the fireplace. She turned at his entry, offering him only the smallest, most distant smile. "You're well, Elizabeth?" he asked. "I'm quite well, thank you." Elizabeth said no more, returning her eyes to the fire. After a moment's hesitation, he moved further into the room, seating himself at a respectful distance. For several long minutes, the only sound between them was the crackle of the fire. "I cannot help but sense a change in you, Elizabeth," he said. "I am afraid I have given offence." She did not turn, instead continuing to watch the fire as she answered, "No offence, only clarity." "Clarity?" She then turned to him. "Sometimes I cannot help but feel you never truly loved me," Elizabeth confessed. It cost her something to say it. And biting her tongue had already taken its toll. "I would not have married you had I not loved you," was his reply. "Then you fail to realise marriage is a journey, not a destination." Darcy studied her face for a moment. Then, fashioning the words that could bring no one more pain than himself, he uttered, "Is it not?" Elizabeth regarded him steadily, patient yet resigned. When it became evident that no response was forthcoming, she rose, placing her embroidery neatly aside. "Good night, Fitzwilliam." His wife's voice carried a sorrow far heavier than any complaint could. At last he understood that some distances once opened could not be closed. Darcy watched as she crossed the room, her steps unwavering. He longed to rise, to call her back, to speak the words he had never permitted himself, but his courage failed him. The part of him that might have chased her was long, buried under years of caution. He remained frozen in place, watching the door close behind her. Left alone, Darcy felt the emptiness of the room expand, filled only by the echo of her wordless reproach. He had succeeded. Elizabeth Bennet, the woman who had once wounded his pride, was now his wife, bound to him by law, yet incapable of wounding his heart. And he knew that what he had truly desired, her affection, her respect, her love, had been lost by his own doing. He had sealed himself inside the sort of victory no one could envy. His wife had turned away, and this time she would not look back. Chapter 17. The drizzle had started not long after Elizabeth left the house. She wandered the narrow path along the lower fields. The ground beneath her boots had grown soft, her steps less sure. Still she did not turn back. There was a strange peace in the afternoon's greyness, a stillness that asked nothing of her. She had not intended to walk so far, nor had she meant to dwell so long on the ache in her chest, a space where hope had once lived, now hollowed by indifference. The slope ahead had always been manageable. She'd climbed it before, dry and sure-footed, but she suffered a misstep, her boots slipping out from under her. Her body twisted sharply, her hands scraping against damp stone and bramble. She landed with a jolt and a sharp cry, half sprawled in the wet grass, her ankle screaming in protest. For a moment she lay still, blinking against the light rain. It was not the pain that unnerved her, it was the sudden sense of helplessness. Then she heard his voice. Elizabeth. She turned her head to find him already there. Darcy stood several paces above, his eyes fixed on her with a focus that stunned her more than the fall. "I am all right," she began, but the words barely cleared her throat before he was kneeling beside her. He did not reply. He was already assessing, his hands at her elbow, checking her ankle, steadying her before she could rise. "You should not have come this way alone," he said at last. Elizabeth tried to smile despite the ache in her ankle. "I did not think to require a rescue party." Rather than respond, he slipped one arm behind her shoulders, the other beneath her knees, and lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all. Her breath caught in her chest from the sudden closeness, the heat from his body despite the rain, and the way his jaw clenched as he looked ahead. Darcy's heart pounded with a force that confounded him. But it was not the exertion, rather it was the memory. Her body nestled against him felt at once unfamiliar and deeply known. The press of her cheek against his collar, the weight of her trust in that moment, he felt it everywhere. He did not look down. He dared not. Nor did he speak. A calming whisper, a gentle reassurance. He only held her tighter. He carried her across the soft ground, back toward the main path. Nearing the house, she said, "Fitzwilliam." "Hush," he interrupted. "You need to be looked at properly." She did not argue. Her heart beat too loudly in her ears. The fall had rattled her, but it was his comportment that left her more unsettled. Once inside the manor house, a maid, alerted by the commotion, hastened forward, but he did not relinquish Elizabeth immediately. He waited until she was safely in the maid's care, his hand lingering at her elbow a moment longer than necessary, as if reluctant to sever the last connection between them. Without meeting Elizabeth's eyes, he said, "See that your mistress is attended at once." Before he left the room, Darcy paused by the hearth. His hand came to rest against the mantel, fingers splaying against the stone as though seeking some anchor. For a moment he remained there, his eyes fixed on the embers. Then, with a slow breath drawn and released, he straightened, his hand falling to his side. Without another glance behind him, he quit the room. He had seen the truth too late, known it. Yet still, when faced with her closeness, her trust, he had faltered. Habit, fear, pride, he no longer cared to name it, only that it ruled him still, and he hated it more than he could say. Darcy shut the door of his study behind him and leaned against it, his heartbeat racing in his chest. He had not expected to feel it, so raw, so urgent. The moment he had seen her on the ground, every defence he had constructed had fractured. He had wanted to stay at her side. He had wanted to say something, anything, that would bridge the distance between them. How long had it been since he had touched her so freely, without calculation, without fear? Her weight in his arms, the slope of her shoulder against his chest, the soft gasp she gave when he lifted her. But if a slip of her foot, a cry of pain, can undo me like that. The maid's hands were gentle as she removed Elizabeth's torn stocking, but Elizabeth barely felt the touch. Her eyes remained fixed on the door Darcy had passed through moments before. He had not said goodbye. He had carried her with such tenderness. Yet, he had looked at her only once, and even then, not fully. And yet, she had felt it, beneath the restraint, beneath the mask he had worn so well for weeks. The same man who once spoke so ardently had returned, for a moment, and then vanished again. Donned in a plush robe, she never felt so alone. Elizabeth did not weep. She would not. She only sat quietly as the fire was built up beside her, and dry stockings were fetched, her thoughts circling the same truth. He had not left her to the elements, injured and alone to fend for herself. Still, he had left her. Chapter 18. Darcy found himself adrift in a solitude far deeper than he had imagined possible. He had not realised how much of his wife's spirited nature had inhabited the house until it was gone. Darcy watched Elizabeth from a distance as she moved through their home, her dignity intact, though her warmth, once bestowed upon him, was now directed everywhere but toward himself. He saw her walking through the gardens, her steps slow, contemplative, always alone. He caught glimpses of her seated with Georgiana, the young girl's laughter mingling with Elizabeth's more restrained replies. He observed how she spoke with the servants, how naturally their respect had shifted toward genuine affection. But always, when Elizabeth's eyes met his own, they held neither accusation nor longing. It was the look of someone who had stopped waiting. One afternoon, as he paused near the music room, Darcy heard the delicate notes of Elizabeth's playing, reminding him of what had captivated him at Rosings Park, when his Aunt Lady Catherine insisted she exhibit. The melody was simple, yet it pierced him to his core. He stood motionless by the door, knowing he had lost the right to join her, to turn the pages of her music, or share even a moment of companionship. When the last notes faded, he stepped away. Later that same evening, Darcy stood alone at the window of his study, the amber glow of the sun fading into the dark. From this vantage he saw Elizabeth again, walking at the edge of the lake, her figure graceful yet solitary. The sight of her reflection shimmering on the water's surface brought a sharp pang of regret. Even her shadow seemed out of reach now. His mind turned inward, revisiting each calculated moment, each withheld word. He had once thought himself clever for managing his sensibilities with such exactness, likening it with strength. Now, standing in his empty study, he recognized his error. He had gambled and he had lost. Not realizing that the manner in which he had earned her esteem, her heart, was the same manner required to keep her. As the door stood open, Georgiana entered, breaking his reverie. He did not turn. He already knew who it was. Only one person in the manor still approached him uninvited. "Brother," she said, "Elizabeth seems so very lonely. Is all well between the two of you?" Darcy looked at his sister, unable to mask the sorrow he now carried. "No, Georgiana, it is not well, and the fault lies with me." It was the first time he had spoken the truth aloud, and it settled over him like the weight it was. "I had hoped that marriage might ease the burdens you always seem to carry." He sighed. "The fault was in my seeking justification, Georgiana," he said, for what he could not say to a sister 10 years his junior, what he now knew, that being vindication. Continuing on, he said, "Instead of seeking to love openly, honestly, I have caused her pain, and now I fear I may have destroyed any chance of true happiness for either of us." Georgiana stepped nearer. "Is it too late, Fitzwilliam?" "Elizabeth is generous in heart. I cannot believe her love is beyond recall." Both comforted and chastened, he met his young sister's eyes. Perhaps not beyond recall, but certainly beyond easy reach. "And I fear, Georgiana, it is my own frailties rather than her generosity that must first be overcome." She squeezed his arm, her face earnest. "Then overcome it, brother. Do not let pride deny you the happiness you both are due." Georgiana's gentle call to act shook Darcy in ways no accusation ever could. Her words lingered long after she'd gone, echoing through the room. He turned again toward the window. Night was upon them, bringing with it a new dawning. How overwhelming the toll on his sensibilities to fully acknowledge the depth of his loss, not merely of Elizabeth's affection, but of his own sense of self, his honour, and his capacity for joy. All had been sacrificed at the altar of pride and self-protection. Darcy closed his eyes. He did not yet know if reconciliation was possible, nor how he might begin to reclaim what he had lost. But he knew, with certainty, that the first step required abandoning all pretences of control. If he were to regain Elizabeth's heart, he must first willingly risk his own. And though he feared it, he feared losing Elizabeth forever far more. Chapter 19. Darcy awoke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the heavy drapes. Sleep had eluded him, the long darkness filled with self-recrimination, silent admissions, and the painful clarity that comes only in the sleepless hours. Each had carved its own confession, and by morning there was no part of him untouched by regret. Later that morning he found Elizabeth in the library, standing at the window, her gaze distant and contemplative, as she watched the morning sun disperse the lingering mist across the lawns. She seemed impossibly far away. Her figure stirred something deep within him. "Elizabeth," he began, stepping across the threshold. She turned to face him. "Fitzwilliam," she replied. He moved nearer, heart pounding, each step measured. "I fear I have interrupted your solitude," he said. "You need not fear interruption. I am lingering here only because the morning is so peaceful." "Peaceful," he said. "I envy you the ability to find peace." Her brow furrowed. "Have you not always sought peace yourself, sir, through reserve and distance?" "I believed I sought peace, but now I see it was only protection." Elizabeth waited for him to say more. He drew a slow breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes fully, honestly. "Elizabeth, when I returned to Hertfordshire, my intentions were not honourable, not in the truest sense. I returned wounded, angry, determined to shield myself from further injury. I wished only to prove, to myself, and perhaps cruelly to you, that I could win your heart without further risking my own, to make you realize what a mistake you had made in refusing my hand." She had no words. This was indeed encouragement enough. "I believed," he thus continued, "that stern regulation over my emotions would protect me. I believed victory would erase the pain of your rejection. I was wrong, grievously, shamefully wrong. In seeking to protect myself, I have wounded you, and I have destroyed the possibility of the very happiness I most desired." Her voice pained. Elizabeth said, "You speak now as if regret might mend all." "Yet your control has been masterful, Fitzwilliam. You have revealed no such vulnerability until now. Why even speak of it when the damage has been done?" Darcy stepped closer. "Because you matter to me, Elizabeth. Far more than pride, more than victory, more even than the security that held me captive, and I dare no longer pretend otherwise." She regarded him intently. "What is it you expect of me now?" "I do not presume to ask for your forgiveness, nor to demand your affection. I seek only your understanding, that you may know the truth of my regret, that you may know, at last, how deeply I lament the pain my lapse has caused you." Elizabeth turned toward the window once more, considering his words. She responded, "Neither understanding nor forgiveness is easy. One requires trust, the other grace, and I am uncertain which I can offer. And if either is beyond your heart to grant, I shall accept that. Yet, I must try to become the man I ought to have been from the beginning." Elizabeth's eyes remained fixed upon the garden beyond the window. Darcy remained close behind her. Gradually the tension between them eased, not entirely dissolved, but shifting into something more hopeful than the estrangement of the days before. At length Elizabeth turned back toward him. "It will take time," she said, "perhaps more time than you expect. I ask nothing more than the chance to remain by your side, Elizabeth. Let my actions speak where words have failed." At length she nodded. "Very well." Relief surged through him. He would not waste this chance. "Thank you," he said. Elizabeth moved past him toward the door, pausing to look back. It is not capitulation, Fitzwilliam, she reminded him, but perhaps it is a fresh start. He watched her go, her steps carrying her out of the room but not out of reach. He remained standing in the room, his heart now laid open, vulnerable yet unafraid. There was much still to prove, much still to regain. Yet he felt, finally, that he had chosen the only path worth taking. He had no promise of success, yet he would walk that path regardless. Chapter 20. In the weeks that followed, Darcy remained steady to his purpose. There was no strategy in him now. When Elizabeth spoke, he listened fully, no longer measuring each response for his own purposes. Elizabeth studied this transformation, her heart cautious but attentive. She had not forgotten their past, nor was forgiveness yet fully within her reach, reminding herself that she had seen this version of him before. Then he had been a man on a mission. Before she'd wondered what he hoped to prove. Now, what he hoped to preserve was uppermost in her mind. No, any lingering doubts must no longer hold unyielding power, Elizabeth considered, preferring instead to see his actions in a favourable light. One morning found them walking along Pemberley's winding garden paths. Once, pauses between them had been filled with strain. Now, once again, they felt companionable. Their conversation moved from estate matters to Georgiana's music, from recent correspondence to less consequential concerns, never pressing too deeply, yet never retreating into polite evasion. At the fountain's edge, Elizabeth slowed, lifting her face to the sunlight. Darcy, caught by the sight, found his breath stilled. He had often admired her beauty, and now more than ever. "Elizabeth," he said, "there is something I must say." She turned to him, her eyes quizzical. "I do not wish to overwhelm you with protestations, yet I can no longer remain silent. Every day spent with you has taught me something of my own heart, something I thought I could control or conceal. The truth, Elizabeth, is that I love you more ardently than I ever thought possible. My love for you is irrevocably yours." He did not look away as he spoke, for there was no longer anything to protect, yet so much to offer. She wanted to believe him, but wanting was not enough. "You speak eloquently, Fitzwilliam," she replied, "but how am I to trust your words now when I cannot help but recall sentiments of a similar vein being uttered before?" He stepped closer, lessening the distance between them. "Trust only what you are seeing. Trust, if you can, that I have learned at last what it means to truly love, not as a means to triumph, but as a reason to surrender." Elizabeth remained silent, weighing his words. After a moment she said, "Surrender, Fitzwilliam? Have you considered that true surrender requires courage from us both? I have opened my heart most ardently to you once already. I fear it may not bear a second disappointment." Darcy, humbled yet resolute, reached toward her hand, pausing just short of touching it, waiting for her permission. "I ask only for the chance to prove myself, not through eloquence or persuasion, but through constancy and patience." Slowly Elizabeth extended her hand until her fingers met his own. The touch was tender, albeit hesitant. "Then let us see, Fitzwilliam, what patience and constancy may bring," she said. It was not surrender, not yet, but it was not refusal either. A profound relief settled within his heart. He closed his fingers around hers, accepting the fragile trust she offered, grateful beyond words for this second chance. "You honour me more deeply than I deserve," he said. "Perhaps," she replied, "but it is the choice of my own heart to give it." They continued their walk, their fingers now fully entwined. Later that evening, as they stood together at the window overlooking the moonlit gardens, Darcy turned toward her. "Elizabeth," he began, "I have wondered many times whether the wounds we carry from our past might ever fully heal." Their eyes met. "Perhaps the purpose of our wounds is simply to remind us to cherish what remains." He reached for her hand again. "And what remains between us?" Elizabeth's smile deepened. "Hope, trust, and the promise of our future felicity, not as we were, but as we might be." Darcy lifted her hand to his lips. "Then let us proceed in that vein, my love. One day at a time." Her fingers tightened around his. One day at a time. Little more than a week later, Elizabeth sat with a book resting in her lap, its pages long forgotten. She had no interest in reading, only to be near him. Darcy occupied the seat opposite, his wishes no doubt akin to hers. Georgiana had taken her leave earlier that morning to visit her Fitzwilliam relations in Matlock, affording her brother and Elizabeth the solitude their rekindling sensibilities needed. No words had passed between them for some time, for so much had already been said. Any lingering discomfort between the lovers had softened into understanding. Elizabeth glanced toward Darcy, taking in his arresting features, the deep set of his brow, the crease at the edge of his mouth that suggested thoughtfulness rather than disquiet. She had come to know these details intimately, had learned to read the man behind the mask, his stillness, his breath when measured, and when it faltered, and the difference between when he withdrew and when he merely rested contentedly beside her. At length Darcy turned to her fully, his countenance unguarded. "How did I ever take such moments as these for granted?" he asked. "I have been such a fool. I should never have endeavoured to shield that which has always been yours from you." Elizabeth did not reply at once. Instead she looked at him, truly looked, and in her eyes was neither surprise nor reproach, but knowing. She extended her hand. He took it, and in that instant something passed between them, a reaffirmation of the promises they had made at the altar. "I have wondered," Elizabeth said, "whether you regretted any part of it, of us." His hand tightened around hers. "Only that I did not love you better, sooner and more openly. Everything led me to this. I never meant to be your reckoning, Fitzwilliam." "You were never that," he said. Darcy brought her hand to his lips and held it there. In that moment he understood what it meant to give love and to be loved in return. "No one, my dearest, loveliest Elizabeth, is loved, needed and wanted more than I do you." Her genuine, knowing smile was all the response he needed. Love is here, Darcy reflected. My heart is now wide open. Epilogue. During the months-long season of courtship between Darcy and Elizabeth, several people, some with scarcely any connection to them that mattered, could not help having an opinion on the match. Surely if Bingley's pernicious sister, Miss Caroline Bingley, had known the reason Mr. Darcy and her brother left town during the height of the London season, she would have given herself an excuse to travel with them as well. Alas, she did not know, and she had no one to blame for losing her place as Pemberley's next mistress but herself, for if she had played no part in separating her brother from Jane Bennet in the first place, and had allowed any attraction to vanish of its own volition, as it invariably must, none of them would have returned to Netherfield Park. For heaven's sake, he had merely let the place, not bought it outright. It was not like it was the only vacant estate in the country. As for Lady Lucas, she did not like to be proven wrong about anything. Of course, she was not surprised by Mr. Darcy's choice of a bride. A man of sense and education and immense wealth could certainly choose a wife from wherever he would. Why would he not choose the brightest jewel in the country? At least this is how she explained herself in public. In privacy, she blamed her son-in-law, as well as her daughter, for leading her astray about Mr. Darcy's so-called peculiar engagement to his cousin. How could they allow her to espouse such nonsense? As for Mr. Collins, the unsolicited letters to Elizabeth kept coming, for he had so much more to say on matters of domestic tranquillity, and all the ways Elizabeth could and should appreciate her situation in life. Knowing his cousin Elizabeth the way he did, having witnessed first-hand her propensity to act against her better interest, he was sure no one else was giving her such necessary advice. Not her mother, and certainly not her father. No, that task fell to him. Elizabeth never replied, and indeed stopped reading them entirely upon perusing the following. For it is well known, cousin Elizabeth, that a woman of sense, when fortunate enough to marry above her station ought never to contradict her husband, even when she mistakenly believes herself to be in the correct, for in such cases her silence is a mark of her gratitude, and her obedience, the truest sign of her virtue. Darcy's noble relation, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, was not entirely silent upon learning of the engagement, nor indeed was she ever known to keep her opinions to herself. In reply to the letter which announced its arrangement, she wrote, "You are determined, I see. Very well, but do not imagine I approve. A young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world, wholly uneducated and without even a governess, and now she's to be held up before my own niece Georgiana as an example of what a lady ought to be, an upstart who knows not a word of Italian nor French, nor any of the refined accomplishments necessary for society. And what of her connections? Are these the people to whom she is to be exposed? Lady Catherine had closed with her most dire pronouncement yet. Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? As delighted as young Georgiana Darcy was upon learning of her brother's engagement, a situation that came as no surprise to her considering the number of times he had mentioned Elizabeth's name in his letters from Hertfordshire and Kent, as well as the formidable introduction to Elizabeth before the wedding, it was nothing compared to the joy she experienced upon seeing the newlywed couple. They had moved past their differences and were now in complete accord, loving each other with their whole hearts, with no pretense of pride and prejudice getting in the way. Two people who were designed for each other. That was how Georgiana described her brother and sister-in-law. She could imagine no two people more deserving of each other's love. The two elder sisters, wedded on the exact same day in a double ceremony, had travelled such varying paths during their first months of marriage, no doubt, owing to their varying temperaments. That of the Bingleys was so much alike. How could they not always find themselves in such a perpetual state of mutually blissful felicity? Leave it to Elizabeth, whose mother often described her as obstinate and headstrong, to fall in love with a gentleman whose temperament was not so easily understood. She was not an open book herself, but oh, the wonder of turning the pages, each bringing something quite unexpected. Challenges, each made richer by the narrative unfolding between them. The truth be told, Elizabeth, as the wife of Mr. Darcy and the mistress of Pemberley, now knowing and understanding what she did, was sure she would not have it any other way. Thanks for reading Love is Here and Now Gone. I hope this story brought you as much joy as it brought me while writing it. If so, please share your thoughts by leaving a quick rating or review. Your support means the world to me. Want to spend more time with Darcy and Elizabeth? Check out these favourites you might have missed. Gravity. Shades of Mr. Darcy till Mr. Fitzwilliam. Darcy is a single man of a large fortune who stands to gain even more wealth and power with the advent of his marriage to his cousin, the sole heiress of Rosings Park. It is his destiny. His family expects the union. He is determined to let nothing stand in his way. Upon accepting an offer to spend the summer at Pemberley, Miss Elizabeth Bennet believed she was in no danger from Mr. Darcy. The two of them met in London and barely tolerated each other. But what happens at Pemberley could not possibly have occurred in London, and it does not take long for Elizabeth to discover that she is indeed in grave danger of falling in love with the gentleman. What about the gentleman's feelings? Will Mr. Darcy remain steady to his purpose and marry his wealthy cousin, or will his desire for Elizabeth make him realise his true purpose is about to unfold? Thank you for listening to Love is Here and Now Gone, written by P.O. Dixon, read by Christopher. If you enjoyed the story, and I sincerely hope you did, please take a moment to like, share, and comment. If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you to do so now. It makes all the difference in encouraging me to share my stories here on YouTube. And be sure to search for and listen to more of my stories like this one, stories that will make you fall in love time and time again. Your continuing support helps this channel grow.